Welcome everyone. My name is Albert Ferrari. I'm a climate policy officer at the Florence School of Regulation, a program of the European University Institute. Thank you everyone for joining. It's really a delight to have you here. It's the first time we present comprehensively the work we've done in the project Capable, Horizon Europe project funded by the European Union. And we intend to have this capacity building workshop as an occasion to share the results, share the finding, and increase the dissemination of our project. Um, we have we had nearly 80 people registering for this event, so we're very happy to welcome you all. And before we jump into the content, I will give you a more presentation on Capable, the training, and then we move on. So overall, the project Capable stands for Climate Policy Acceptability Economic Framework. What we want to do is to improve the knowledge of public perception of climate policy, to address the challenges between the effectiveness of policies as well as and their social and political feasibility, and also try to understand, in a way, the role of policymakers in these policies. So going a bit, trying to understand how they perceive climate science, how they perceive their role in climate policies, and trying to connect all the dots. This will provide us the basis to draw a recommendation to plan a socially and economically acceptable climate policy measures. How do we do that? First, we do that combining interdisciplinary competencies, economics, social psychology, political science, and environmental science. You will see through the training that we really have a multidisciplinary team. Second, we aim to improve the way we assess policies, methodological and empirical strategies in policy evaluation, considering both the economic and social aspects. And last, we aim to enrich the decision-making process by amplifying the existing economic framework. The project is a project led by CMCC, but include partners from Italy, like also EUI, Element 6, from France, IESEG and CNRS, from Germany, PIC, as well as Prague, CUNY, the Charles University, but also UAB from Barcelona, the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and ETH Zurich in Swiss. The budget is approximately 3 million euros, and we're really approaching the closure of the project in December 2025. So regarding the training itself, we want in this training to help you to be able to assess the effectiveness of future and current climate policies, to understand the potential but also the limits of policy assessments of the methods. And in terms of climate policy acceptability and perception, many of you were interested in that topic in particular, to understand the determinants and the factor that influence the acceptability of climate policies, and have an overview of newly implemented or potential new climate policies are perceived by citizens. The program, we shared it with you earlier on, but overall, after this introduction, we will have an overview on what are the EU climate policies, a small coffee break, and then on the module 2, focus more on acceptability of climate policy. At the end of the training, we'll welcome the European Commission to give us a small testimonial to also understand how science is taken into account in EU climate policies, and we'll slowly move on to the conclusion. Some rules and principles for this training. In terms of format, there will be several lectures by academics and project partners of Capable. At the end of each presentation, so at the end of the presentation of each speaker, there will be a Q&A for you to ask any question you may have. There will also be a Q&A with the testimonial from Vicky Pollard from the European Commission. In terms of questions, we would suggest you to first write your questions in the chat. Then if further clarification is needed, we may ask you to expand a bit. All along the training, we will move on from slides to polls, and I will give you more information on how the polls will work in a bit. Two other notes that are probably important. First, we would very much like to publish the recording of the event with your agreement. That means, yeah, do let us know if that is an issue for you. And if you don't want to appear, maybe we would recommend you not using your webcam and changing eventually the name. And at the end of the training, we will provide a certificate of attendance to all participants that attended the entire event. Now, let's go to the poll quickly. So we will, all along the course, we will use this Mentimeter. So you can open it on your phone, you can open a tab on your computer with this and keep it open, because we'll go back to the same room and link every now and then. I guess you all received, you all used similar tools before, but overall a question will appear. We'll ask you to vote, submit your vote, and the lecturer will be invited to comment on the answers. We can already test the poll right now if you have an interest to understand a bit where people come from today in the training. Very well, a lot of La Réunion, welcome, Italy, France, Spain. Very interesting. I see you all are taking part. A majority from Italy, Spain, and Germany. And well, very well. I think you proved that you can do that. Now, without further ado, I think I will invite our first lecturer to take the stage, Simone Borghesi. Simone Borghesi is my director at the Florence School of Regulation, the climate area. Is director of FSR Climate and professor at the University of Siena and at the European University Institute. Today, he will give us no hard task, complex task, to give you an introduction to EU climate policies in less than 30 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you for the hard task. And thank you all for being here. Let me start by sharing my screen and the presentation. Please let me know if you can see it. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so as Albert was saying, I will try to give a short intro on the EU climate policies. Many of you will know them, but just to make sure we are on the same page, I will try to give a general context, a bit of a historical background, a framework that led us here, and then move to some more specific aspects. So the very general context, since we are talking about climate policies, is obviously climate change, which is defined by Article 1 of the UNFCCC as change of climate, which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere. It is observed over a comparable time period. This diagram on the top right shows the evolution that greenhouse gases had from the Industrial Revolution, basically 1850, up to today. Is probably familiar to many of you with the distinction between CO2 from fossil fuels or from LULUCF and non-CO2 emissions. And this rapid, I would say almost exponential increase that greenhouse gases followed during the Industrial Revolution phase led to an increase in global surface temperature by 1.1 Celsius degrees by 2011-2020 compared to the second part of the 19th century. Obviously, this urged climate policies, defined as actions taken by governments at various levels, local, regional, national, international, for mitigation or adaptation. And at the international level, certainly a key point, a cornerstone, has been represented by the Paris Agreement, which was adopted by 196 parties on December 12, 2015. It is now 10 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. So 2025 is somehow an important moment, 10 years after the Paris Agreement. And we are on the way to COP30, and so it's important to take stock of where we are. The Paris Agreement has as an explicit objective the one to limit the increase in the global temperature to well below 2 Celsius degrees above the pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know that we are not on track probably for these targets, and that is why the next meeting in COP30 is so important. A bottom-up approach was envisaged by the Paris Agreement, with 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate plans by countries, or so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And to achieve the goals of the NDCs and the Paris Agreement, what we are asked to do are different kinds of interventions: domestic actions, cooperation and support through finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. Paris was certainly a big success, especially as we were coming from the Kyoto area, and the Kyoto Protocol was not particularly successful, and it took some time to achieve a new agreement. So certainly the Paris Agreement, as I said, is a cornerstone, was a big important change, but it needs to be implemented, fully implemented, and there's still a long way to go. Europe has a track record of climate policies and has been played a leading role, not only in Paris, but also before and after Paris. We can say that the European Union has been a pioneer and a leader in climate policies, with emissions reduction objectives that have been increasingly ambitious. In 2022, the European greenhouse gas emissions had decreased by 32.5% as compared to 1990. And the updated evidence shows a 37% reduction by 2023. This is the result actually of a long way that started long before. Already back in the 90s, the program SAVE and Alternative on energy efficiency and alternative energies had opened the way, paved the way to the consequent measures. And here you have a list a timeline of these numerous measures that Europe put in place. In particular, I personally recall the 2020 Energy and Climate Package, a very effective communication tool, I would say, because of a unique number that repeatedly remains somehow in the imagination of people as a clear target. The target was achieved, it was actually overcome, and so the ambition kept increasing up to the 2019 European Green Deal, and the story goes on, the Fit for 55, the Repower EU, and so on and so forth. As a result of these policies, the EU emissions, as I said, decrease remarkably, and here you have a diagram showing where the reduction took place, mainly in power and industry, not so much, or actually not at all, in transport, building, agriculture, waste. Some of these sectors, like transport, for instance, you can see actually increase their emissions in between. The EU climate policy toolbox is a very rich one. So the EU adopted a large array of measures to achieve the goals set by the Paris Agreement. And this nice diagram that I have inherited from Albert, I have to say, so thank you for this, Albert, is a representation of the numerous ways the Europe climate policies operates through market-based instruments, command and control policies, subsidies and grants, institutional governance, awareness, and voluntary actions. Within each of these tools, we have sub-tools. We have other tools that can enter the specific category. For instance, market-based instruments can be distinguished, divided into the UTS, feed-in premiums, or energy efficiency certificates. Command and control are composed of RES targets, emission standards, and regulations. Subsidies and grants operate on research, innovation, and technologies. Institutional governance through plans and strategies, international negotiations, and national energy and climate plans. And finally, awareness and voluntary actions through measures like the European Climate Pact and the European Climate Ambassadors, eco-labels, and certification for carbon removals. So a very rich map, as you see, and many different measures in operation. And there are different layers of operation: international, European, national, local. At the international level, Europe operates through the UNFCCC Secretariat and co-presidency, ensuring that the sum of all NDCs are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. At the European level, the European Commission with the Council and the Parliament define the targets, review the NECPs, and consolidate them into a unique European NDC. At the national level, the member states then translate these targets into national objectives, prepare the NECPs and the eventual national energy and climate strategies, and down at the bottom, at the local level, regions and local authorities set up energy and climate planning that are in line with the national objectives and rules. So the whole map you see has operations that go from the global international level down to the city level. And all, I would say, these levels, these layers are extremely important and have to be consistent among themselves. All these levels have a unique objective, those of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The diagram to the left shows the historical and projected sectoral greenhouse gas emissions from 2015 to the mid-century. And as you see from the line, some work has already been done up to 2025. We had some important, remarkable achievements, but the way is still long and the road is still very steep to get there. The main ingredients to do this are represented by a gradual tightening of the policies, a coordinated vision at all levels, carbon price at the core, no one left behind as a general principle on the consequences of these measures, and finally, investments to roll out innovation. You see how steep the curve is. You see that the line gets to zero by 2050, but that by 2050, there is still some emissions left, some residual emissions in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. Therefore, we will need them to be compensated by those below the horizontal axis, negative emissions. And on this, I would like to show you this dynamic slide that shows in gray the historical emissions up to 2020, and then the so-called remaining carbon budget. So how many emissions we can allow from 2019. So we had 380 gigatons of CO2 still remain if we want to stay below 1.5. This amount can be completely, let's say, spent rapidly, bringing the curve steeply down immediately, or we can try to have and follow different paths where positive emissions are a bit higher, so the curve is a bit smoother. But in that case, obviously, we need to go into more negative emissions. So you see the curve getting smoother and higher, and the green area below the horizontal axis getting larger and larger. So at the end of the day, however, 380 are the gigatons that are left. And this is somehow mathematics that we cannot avoid, and we have to always keep in mind. Europe decided to go for a main tool, cornerstone of its policies, represented by the EU ETS, which was one of the elements that I showed you before in the market-based instruments. Again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, you perfectly know that the EU ETS is a cap and trade system where the regulatory authority sets a cap, the maximum amount of pollution allowances, and then allocates them among the polluting companies. At the beginning, most of the emissions allowances were granted for free, but Europe progressively moved towards auctioning of the allowances, and today 57% of the allowances are auctioned on the primary market. And then these allowances can be traded among the market operators on the secondary market, leading to a market price, which applies the so-called polluter pays principle. The EU ETS covers today 37% of the European emissions as of 2022. It used to be 47, but emissions fell, so today we are at around 37. Covers more than 10,000 installations across 30 countries. It was divided into 4 phases of increasing lengths, from the 3-year phase 1, which was the learning phase, 2005-2007, up to the current phase. We are now in phase 4, which covers the whole decade. Phases of increasing length, and also a policy that is increasingly stringent, because the cap keeps decreasing over time and decreases faster and faster. And as of today, or at least of 2023, EU emissions from the European power and district plants fell by 47.6% compared to the beginning of the EU ETS, 2005. And 2023 actually marked a record year with a decrease of 15% with respect to the previous year. So this led Europe to further increase the ambition, and the target was raised to 62% by 2030. Here you have a map distinguishing the trend of the emissions before and after the 23 in the sectors that are covered, so electricity and heat generation, energy intensity, and commercial aviation. And you see In red, you have all the stationary installations and a clear decreasing trend, but that was dominated, spurred by the yellow line, the combustion of fuels, so power and industry, but not so much by the other lines. Here you have the manufacturing and the aviation sectors. This is up to 23. Then after 23, so from 24 onwards, what you can observe is an increasing ambition. As I said, the target led to increase to 62% by 2030, and also an increasing reduction of allowances per year. So the cap reduction was 2.2% per year at the beginning. It was increased to minus 4.3% per year over the current period, and it will be further raised to minus 4.4 per year over the period 28-30. So as I said, the cap is decreasing, and it's decreasing faster and faster. And the system has been extended, with its scope being extended to the maritime sector, which accounts for relatively little emissions, around 3%, but the projected emissions are expected to increase by 130% in the future if no intervention is taken. So that's why the maritime sector was also included, and a new sector, a new system was envisaged, the so-called EU ETS2 system. And the reason is clear when you look at this diagram, which is a bit more granular than the diagrams I showed you before. So you have, again, energy and industry that we said have led the decrease. And then you have the other sectors. And you can clearly see that transport had an increasing path from 1990 to 2018. And here on the right, you can tell the percentage increase of emissions of this sector. So those that are above the line, or if you want, to the right of the line of percentage line, are CO2 biomass, internal shipping, internal aviation, and overall transport. We need to address particularly these sectors where emissions have increased. So the EU ETS2 was born. It was planned. It's a new cap and trade system that is currently under development, which will cover buildings, road transport, and the small industry emitters across the 27 EU member states, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, as in the case of the EU ETS, so to speak, 1. It will address their CO2 emissions. It's planned to start in 2027, 28 if exceptionally high gas prices and oil prices will occur in 26. With a stability reserve mechanism to reduce price fluctuations, in particular, and this is a big change, with a price cap at 45 euros, which was the ETS price in 2020. If prices remain above 45 for 3 consecutive years, then new allowances will be released. The cap reduction target is 42%, and covered entities are fuel distributors and with allowances being fully auctioned. Since no one should be left behind, a social climate fund of 86.7 billion euros has been planned from 26 to 32, with different levels of intervention and support to vulnerable sectors. As you see, the EU ETS keeps changing, is a moving target, extends its coverage, and wants to address a few challenges, in particular the social acceptability that will be discussed during this training, wants to preserve the competitiveness of the industrial sector. And we also have a big challenge in looking into the future, anticipating what we can call the afterlife of the EUTS, because we know, and some studies like the one by Michael Pall and others have shown, that we at this pace, we will run out of allowances by 2040 or so. So this requires measures to address the lack of liquidity that might occur in the system in the future. As I often describe it in my presentations, I think the UTS is a kind of living creature because it keeps changing. Indeed, as a living creature, it was born as a first transboundary cap-and-trade system. It kept growing over these 20 years with additional sectors and gases. It was teaching somehow to the others, to the other jurisdictions, being a prototype for all its followers, but they also learn from the followers, learn from common experiences, and learn from our own mistakes, I would say. So we had reforms as a continuous learning process, also inspired by our companions, by the other ETSs that were born worldwide. And this image from ICAP shows where these systems were born after Europe. And today we have 38 emission trading systems around the world, those the areas in blue, 11 under development and 9 under consideration. Over these years, the global expansion of the ETS, so the share of the global greenhouse gas emissions of ETS has more than tripled. It was 5% in 2005. It is around 18% nowadays. And in the meantime, revenues have increased. And in this diagram, you can see the one on the right, that the revenues in blue, the ETS ones, have increased rapidly and now are 69% of all the carbon pricing entries. So from ETSs or taxes that are in operation in 73 jurisdictions. And the diagram on the left shows the rapid increase of the ETS coverage, and with, you see 18%, as I said, of the emissions now being covered by ETSs, 5.5 by carbon taxes. So a long way has been a long journey, I would say, has characterized the European climate policies. A long way is still to go. And we are working somehow on this, also in collaboration with the other jurisdictions. In particular, at the EUI, we have this so-called Florence process in which the ETS regulators get together to discuss the difficulties and to exchange information on the processes back home. These are the projects that we are leading at EUI, LifeCause, the Collaborative Observatory for the Assessment of the UTS, which is exactly the project I was describing, illustrating with ETS regulators taking active part in our conversations. Capable, the reason why we're here today, the Climate Policy Acceptability Economic Framework, and finally, SPES, the Sustainability, Performances, Evidence and Scenarios. There's another Horizon project on the measurement and analysis framework of sustainable human development and transition. So, as you see, most of them are about to finish at the end of the year or beginning of next year. But I think they have all been quite effective and productive. At least for me, there were great opportunities to learn. As I said, teaching and learning, yes, there is more learning than teaching probably. And just to conclude, I want to leave you with some suggested readings. Some of them are of general nature, reports from IPCC, UNFCCC, the European Commission, or from my colleague Jos de Beek and others on these issues. Others are outcomes of the projects that I was describing. So from papers or reports from life cause, SPES, Capable, and other recent publications with my team members or other colleagues. So just in case you want to dig deeper, I leave you with these readings. And please feel free to reach out to me if you want to further discuss some of these aspects. On this note, I'll stop and I leave the floor to the questions. And maybe Albert, I don't know if this can be the right time. We might launch the poll question now, and then we move on to the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Simone. Actually, we are running a bit late, so we only have less than 4 or 5 minutes for Q&A. We can do the poll if you want. I can launch it now, but there are already one question in the chat, as you wish.
Then maybe, why don't you launch it and in the meantime, I answer the question.
So let me do it now on the present. So the question is a test on whether you did listen to the presentation. It's about the EU ETS. How much did greenhouse gas emission decreased under the EU ETS between 2005 and 2023? Simone, we start to see the answers of the poll. If you want to give a comment or tell us what was the right answer.
Let's give some time for people to think. Read. Do you mind, Albert, if in the meantime, because I see we have little time, if I go on to the question by Francesco? There is a question by Francesco Peruzzi, who is really a spicy question, I would say, Francesco, because Francesco is asking me if the fall in emissions due to deindustrialization was due to deindustrialization rather than technological shift, particularly for the industry sector. So I read it in case the others don't read it. Do you agree that ETS and other climate policies by the EU have been effective in the power sector, but not in the industrial sector? Well, if I may, I disagree. I don't think that this was the case. I don't think that this was the result of deindustrialization. I know that somehow this is the narrative that has been going on recently, but it is not supported by evidence in the literature. Actually, the studies I know in the literature try to disentangle the reduction of emissions due to, say, the industrialization versus the one due to climate policies, tend to find an effect of the climate policies. So I'm not here to say that, we are in the first best, we are in the perfect world where the EU ETS needs no changes and is the solution for all sins. It's not the case, but some improvements are needed on a solid, robust tool that, in my view, has been very effective. And the idea of deindustrialization actually it has been used, in my view, somehow to justify a recent request for slowing the pace of the environmental policies, of the climate policies. And I tend to disagree on this. I think we should keep on, because we have evidence of effective results. Obviously happy to discuss it further.
Thank you, Simone. Now for the poll, we had 28 answers. Majority seems to say that the greenhouse gas emission under the UTS reduced from 32.5%. What was the right answer? Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you for your intervention, and it was a pleasure to have you. Unfortunately, Simone has to go for an important meeting now, but it's also time to move on to the next module on actually very much related to the question of Francesco on policy assessment, what works. For this presentation, I have the pleasure to welcome three speakers. Marie, Research Associate at the European University Institute and a PhD candidate at the Paris-Nanterre University and the Climate Economics Chair. She will tell us what ex-post assessment can tell us about climate policies. And then we will follow up with Jan Minx, the head of the Evidence for Climate Solutions Working Group at PIC, as well as Kai. Jan will focus on research synthesis, and Kai Lessmann, a senior scientist and head of the Future Lab on Public Economics and Climate Finance at PIC also, will tell us more about ex-ante studies and modeling, and also what we have done within Capable. So welcome to the three of you. The floor is to you, Marie. Maybe one last comment. After every presentation, there will be a time for Q&A. So after Marie, Jan, and Kai.
Yes, hello everyone. So thank you for the introduction, Albert. So as you said, in this session, we are mapping the policy analysis, policy assessment toolkit. So I start with ex-post, so what happened and why. Then Jan will introduce evidence synthesis, so what the totality of studies says. And then finally, Kai will discuss ex-ante, so what might happen. And the main goal of this session is to clarify the roles of each type of assessments and sharpen how we judge evidence. So straight into the Mentimeter. So actually I have to stop sharing, I think, so that we can go on to our Mentimeter question. And so the question is, we want to get to know you better. And we want to know what types of scientific evidence you use in your work. So as the poll is going to be shown to you, what I can clarify is that when I say scientific evidence, what we mean is that we want that the results should be drawn from transparent methods, systematic data, and reasoned inference. And we have to make sure to clarify whether or not there's uncertainty where it comes from in the results. These research can be qualitative, quantitative, experimental, observational. The main key behind scientific evidence is that there needs to be methodological rigor and replicability. So I see we have already a lot of answers. You can tick all of the options that apply. And yes, the last option I wrote, it's non-scientific evidence, but it depends actually. There's a methodology behind behind these expert or practitioner experience. If it's just your gut feeling, then obviously, as I just explained what scientific evidence is, doesn't count. So what I see here is that it's quite mixed between impact studies and synthesis or review of existing studies. Those are the two that lead. Okay, that's interesting. We can move on to the next question, which is, so we were curious to know how important the research design is for you in the selection of the evidence. So 1 is not important at all, and 5 is very important. And so to clarify, research design, it's the plan that researchers set up to generate, in order to answer their research questions. So it includes the data used, the methodology used, and this is the part that ensures that we can believe the results, or the results are credible and that they're transparent. Okay, so it's very important. I mean, that's reassuring to know. I think because we're short on time, we can stop here. Thank you for answering the questions, and I'll go right into my presentation. So, let's see. Oh, great. Okay. Okay. So my contribution today, it's very short, so I will keep it short and hopefully give you enough insight. But I focused on ex post analysis. So how we evaluate policies after they've been implemented. The key question is simple. We want to know, did the policy actually work as intended, and under what conditions and why? So Simone just described that there's a huge framework behind these policies. We put a big effort in designing them, but often we don't really know how well they've worked in practice, or at least that's what ex post analysis is for. It helps us close the loop between design, so what we think will happen in theory, and then implementation, what we observe in practice. So this ex post analysis allows us to learn from experience. So it enables to know which instruments actually deliver emissions reductions, innovation, or fairness, and in what context. Without this feedback, policy learning remains incomplete, and we risk repeating the same design mistakes. So in short, ex post assessment is the reality check of policy design, where we have ex ante design that relies on models and scenarios and projections. Ex post relies on observed data and real-world outcomes. So it asks, for example, did emissions fall? Did firms innovate? Were costs manageable? And by answering these questions, it feeds evidence back into the next policy cycle. So it informs synthesis, that will be discussed later, but also it informs redesign. So how to redesign these policy tools to make them effective, or so that these policies have the effects that we want them to have. So we have different types of ex post assessment. They vary in depth and purpose. Some are descriptive, so we track indicators like emissions, prices, or energy updates before and after a policy is introduced, and it shows what happened, but not necessarily why it happened. Then we have causal assessments. So they go one step further and they ask what would have happened without the policy. And in this type of evaluation, the idea of a counterfactual is central to this impact evaluation. So the challenge is that we don't observe this counterfactual because we can't run history twice, but econometric and statistical methods allow us to approximate it. So what I show in the graph, you see the observed trend. It's just a conceptual graph, but you see the observed trend under the policy, and you compare it to estimated counterfactual. And the gap represents the policy's measured effects. Then other types of exposed assessment, we have diagnostic or behavioral analyses, and these are the ones that look inside the black box of implementation, and they ask how does the policy function in practice, so not the impact, but how does it function in practice, and what behavioral patterns or responses emerge among firms, households, or regulators, depending on the target of the policy. Qualitative and case study work then complements that by exploring why certain responses occur. So exploring institutional, political, social mechanisms that shape outcomes. And finally, comparative or synthesis studies, they combine multiple exposed assessments to identify broader lessons. But this will be discussed in more details by Jan after me. Yeah, in a nutshell, exposed analysis ranges from describing what happened to explaining why and how much of this event, how much effect has this a certain policy had, and together these pieces, they make policy learning possible. So let's make this concrete. With the case of the EU emissions trading system that Simone already introduced to you. And here I want to underline the difference between two different types of exposed analysis. And I saw earlier that actually one of the authors of the graph that I'm showing on the left is among us. So if we take a diagnostic or performance view on the left, we can say that emissions from covered sectors in the EU ETS fell by roughly 50% between 2005 and 2025. That's a strong result, but it's a descriptive one. So it tells us in details what happened, but it doesn't answer the question why. When we move on to the right, we apply causal or impact evaluation. There we ask a different question. How much of that reduction that we observe can actually be attributed to the ETS itself? So here I show you the example of one paper by Antoine Dechet-Leprêtre and his co-authors. And the figure you can see that it compares ETS and non-ETS industrial installations across Europe. And the key here is how to pick those non-ETS industrial installations. It's the counterfactual. And they carefully matched by different sector and characteristics. In the figure, you see that before 2005, both groups followed very similar emission trends. This is a methodological sign that tells you it's an important sign that the counterfactual chosen is credible. And then a key thing with this figure is what you see is after 2005. So after the ETS started, the pattern reverses. So you have emissions from ETS installations that drop below, so it's very limited, but drop below non-ETS installations. And this change, after accounting for other factors, they actually represent the causal effect of the ETS. And overall, the empirical consensus is that the ETS accounts for less than 20%, actually close to 10%, depending on the studies, but of the total observed reduction for the period 2005 to 2012. Please note the 2012. So what we can say is that, and this insight is actually drawn from we discussed this a bit more in details in one of the papers that we are working with Simone, that we worked on during this capable project. So what we can say from this is that the ETS clearly contributed to emission reduction, but most of the 50% in emission reductions total decline that we observed came from other factors. So the financial crisis, renewable policies, energy efficiency measures, and structural shifts in industry. What I wanted to show you with this slide is that descriptive performance trends and causal impacts are not the same thing. Ex post evaluation helps us separate different policy effects just separate the effect from coincidence or other factors, and it gives a more accurate sense of what types of policies actually worked. I see that I'm running a bit short on time, but I just wanted to mention the limits of ex post assessment. So you have data gaps and delayed availability. For example, the studies that I mentioned, it was published in 2023, but the data stops in 2012. So it's important to strengthen data infrastructure and improving open registry and availability of data to make analysis faster. Another challenge is the uncertainty, the challenge behind constructing a counterfactual that is credible. And for this, you can use mixed methods or synthesis analysis that is discussed later, with triangulating evidence to make it's just to strengthen our confidence in the results. Then there's also this issue of attribution, because one policy actually evolves within a framework with different policies, so there may be policy overlap. And so jointly evaluating these policies remains important as well. And finally, perhaps maybe the most challenging is that the policy cycle moves faster than research. And by the time we have robust evidence, the context has often changed. Yes, so that's it. I just want to say that ex post analysis is very important, but they have limit. This type of research has limits in terms of data availability. It takes time to create these results. And so linking ex post insights to ex ante modeling can make policy learning much more continuous, which maybe will be discussed later as well. And that's where I will stop, so that the next speakers can introduce these methodologies and can have an overview of assessments in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you very much. That was very interesting to take a step back and understand how it works.
Apologies if it was very fast paced.
It was very clear. If anyone has questions for Marie, feel free to write it in the chat. I don't see any for now. So in the meantime, maybe can you explain us to what extent also the work of Capable that you do on the 2 decades, what can it tell you about, for instance, industrial emissions, the question of Francesco?
Yes, thank you, Dodge. Thank you for your question, Albert. So to clarify what we do in this paper, it's a research letter titled The EU Emissions Trading System, Insights from 2 Decades of Evolution. We don't actually carry out ex post analysis. We review some of the literature that does. And so the main insight is that the reduction, that the ETS has been, yes, it has been effective in reducing emissions, but the effect is limited. And the main effects are seen for the power sector, and industrial emissions have decreased, the emissions, so there is an effect attributed to the ETS in the reduction of emissions from industrial sector, but it's comparatively little to the power sector.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There is a question from Gregor that could actually be addressed by the 3 panelists, I suppose, but you can already give your take if you want. Is it possible to compare the ex post analysis with the ex-ante analysis in the Commission impact assessment that accompanied the legislative proposal?
I think for this answer, it would be better to wait
Yeah,
for when we
let's
have.
take it then at the
Because
end
there is a
after
time
Kali.
in this session where we will take questions after all of
Perfect.
the session. It's a bit of a
So
shame.
let's do this. And the question from Juliette, I will ask to every speaker whether it's possible to make the slides available. I think for this one there should not be an issue, but we'll send you the available one after the workshop. Thank you. Now, Jan, are you with us? Welcome.
Yes, I am. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for the invitation and to contribute to this. Let me quickly share my screen. I will now continue where Marie has kind of stopped. She focused on methods for primary studies to evaluate ex post evaluations. And I will continue that and focus on evidence synthesis. How do we synthesize studies? There are two basically broad areas. One is on mapping, and one is on actual synthesis, and I will go through them consecutively. So on the evidence mapping, I would claim that it's really important that we actually have easy access and know what evidence we have. And I would also claim fundamentally that as a community, we don't have a good overview. Even experts in their fields today don't know anymore what the available evidence is. And why is that? Because there's so much evidence. This is just an example from a few studies that we did on the climate literature only in the Web of Science. And this is about 40% of the scientific literature. And if you look at this, then you can see that, for example, in a recent year, we had many studies. In my shared slide, I will add the axis here. Apologies for this oversight. I think the number is 70,000. If I remember correctly, about 70,000 studies per year on climate in the Web of Science. And if you compare this, then we can see that this is larger than the scientific literature on climate that we have for the first 3 IPCC assessments. You can also look at this in a different way. So the studies that were published during the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC is twice as large as the literature that was available for all the other assessment cycle. And I would say this is actually an opportunity because we have more evidence, right? We have more evidence that's in principle good, but it's also a challenge because it's much harder to keep oversight. So I would derive 2 claims from this. One is synthesizing evidence is increasingly important. So actually, reconciling, the different studies should play a larger role given that we have more and more evidence. And then I think given the amount of evidence we have, we need to really look into how AI can help to stay abreast with the state of knowledge. And this also then explains why we may want to map the evidence, because we just want to know what is out there. And this is what we've done in Capable for the field of climate policy. So if you do evidence mapping, what you do is you are very transparent. You write out your research question. So in our case, what is the available evidence on climate policy instruments? And basically outline this in a protocol so that it's basically reproducible for other people who are reading this. We then define a transparent literature search, which means we need to define which kind of bibliographic database we use, like the Web of Science or Scopus. We here used OpenAlex. This is the largest open access bibliographic database that is available. And then you also need to define how you search. So you need to define a search string, which we defined around climate and climate policies. That gave us more than a million records overall. And from this, basically, we then needed to select, well, so what are the relevant studies on climate policy? And we did that by, first of all, hand screening about 2,500 or 2,600 titles and abstracts based on transparent selection criteria. So is there a climate policy instrument being discussed or a climate policy being discussed? And we use that to train a machine learning classifier and apply this then to our results from the search string and got around 85,000 relevant studies. From that, we obviously then want to know what this is about. So we need to extract data. We use the same training data, which we also labeled in terms of what climate policy instruments are actually discussed, what sectors they cover, what geography this is in, and again, applied those trained machine learning classifiers, applied those, and then we use this to analyze this and make this available on an interactive website. And as you can see from the kind of numbers that we have here, the scale is really large. And so we used machine learning and have actually now a living system that continuously tracks the evidence and classifies this. This is kind of how the interface looks. When I distribute my slides, you can play around with this. So you can select sectors, the policy instrument, and you can also have an open search field. You can also have a geographic map of this, etc. What do we find from this map? As I said, about 85,000 pieces of scientific evidence. Most of this evidence is actually on ex ante studies. So about 2/3 are ex ante, about 1/3 are ex post. Among the exposed studies, there are not only evaluations. Evaluations, in fact, are relatively scarce. There are just a few thousand of them. So this is actually something where we have a bit less evidence. There's also a strong bias in the scientific literature towards economic instruments. So particularly in the years before 2010, this is really about 90% or so of the literature is actually on economic instruments, but this has decreased significantly over the past decade. It doesn't still change the overall picture that economic instruments are most widely studied today, even though regulations are super important, but we have much, much less evidence on these regulations and how effective they are. There's also a strong sectoral bias towards energy sector studies compared to other studies, particularly in the industry sector, but also transport and buildings. As I said, we have this evidence available through our website. You can play around with this. We will continue to keep this updated. And it's just very important when we fund research, when we want to have access to evidence find studies, that we have systems that allow us to do this much faster. And this is an initial attempt that we did in the Capable project. Now I want to come to the field of synthesis. So this means systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which kind of ask the question, how effective are climate policies? What are their co-impacts? And I will present here an example from carbon pricing. Why should we do evidence? So why should we do evidence synthesis? Look at this. This is from the field of medicine, where we have studies on different things we eat and how they cause or prevent cancer. If you now think of a situation where you have a single study, then it's quite important. Is it this guy, or another guy that will really drive what you conclude for this evidence? So that cannot be a good approach, right? So what I would argue is, particularly when you want to use evidence for informing policy, you need to consider the entire evidence, and you need to apply then also rigorous methods, as indicated on the right side, but I will talk about this in a second. What is the state of doing synthesis in the climate field or on climate policies? I think in the field of modeling, we are pretty good. We have a powerful tool there as a community that we regularly use, which are model intercomparisons. And they have really helped us to make big progress in both understanding the climate system, climate impacts, but also to understand solution spaces. Where we have been much less successful is in the when it comes to empirical evidence, and where we want to understand, as Marie highlighted, what worked, what policy worked, under what conditions, for whom and why. And this is the field where methods like systematic reviews, evidence gap maps, and the meta-analysis come in, but we are not using them regularly, and I think that is a problem. Let me give you an example, and it's not about scapegoating, a particular author. This is a result of a very influential study, the most cited study on carbon pricing that is available at the moment, and it basically says that carbon pricing essentially is not effective. The author says it's about 0 to 2%, and even if you then actually, so what is done is just a traditional literature review where authors read studies and then come to their conclusion. And often, even though we try our best, we can't actually digest all this information. If you actually code up the studies that are included, these are the kind of effect sizes in this paper. And if you weigh them, then you see with the blue line that the effect is quite different to what the author says. As I'm saying, this is not about scapegoating. It's an example. I think this is really the situation we are in when dealing with empirical evidence, that we are not using scientific methods to do this. And this is a community problem, not a problem of a particular author. So what do they do in other fields, particularly health, but also in international development in law, in crime, in education? They do systematic reviews. Synthesis is a science, and we need to have transparent methods with everything we do, also when we synthesize evidence. And this is basically these are the basic steps that you do when you perform a systematic review. So you actually lay out your research questions, this is important, and the scope, and you define that in a protocol. So in our example that I will show, we focused on carbon pricing evaluations, mainly from quasi-experimental studies, because experimental ones are not available. Then we developed a search string where we tried to get all evidence, because you should have all evidence. You should not leave out studies. It's obviously impossible to have all studies, but you should do your best to find as many as you can, and also in a way that others can follow. Then you screen the studies based on your inclusion criterion. So in our case, is it on carbon pricing? Is it using certain quasi-experimental study designs? And then you extract the information. In our case, quantitative effect sizes in the studies. And obviously, what's important, because that you then harmonize those, because they come from different studies, so to make them comparable. That's also an important step that we need to do. Otherwise, we can't compare anything. Another important step then is, for each study that you include, you need to actually assess the quality in terms of the internal validity of the study and the external validity, and lay this out. Then you need to have, and this is the most fundamental thing, a method to synthesize the results. In our case, we use meta-regression methods to do so, and then obviously we need to report this. Let me give then an example that also then which we actually wrote to find out what the effect of different carbon pricing schemes are. Considering the studies, you can see on the left-hand side that we found about 100 studies, and that the evidence is quite diverse. So we have a lot of evidence on the Chinese ETS and the EU ETS, much less on others, like the Swiss ETS. And we can also see that the effect sizes vary depending by scheme. So for example, we have average effects of I don't know, about 15% for the Finnish carbon tax, and we have 30% for the Chinese pilots. Overall, across all schemes, the average effect has been about 10%. And then on the right-hand side, you also see that each study is actually, we assess the quality, the risk of bias. This is the internal quality and the internal validity. And good studies have a low risk of bias. And you can see that this actually differs quite importantly, hugely. And that with some studies, for some ETS, we don't have studies with low risk of bias, like for the Swiss ETF, for the Australian carbon tax, for the Korean ETS, and that we also have a lot of studies overall with medium risk of bias. The other thing is then statistical power, and this is also a problem. If you look at the Chinese pilot ETS, we have a lot of under-pilot studies, so it's important for us to then understand that the effect that is reported might be inflated. So what are the main findings from the studies? Just to give you an idea, carbon pricing works, I would say, overall, but the size of the effect depends on the scheme. Statistically significant emission reductions range between 5 to 21%, depending on the scheme. Our statistical analysis suggests that the scheme themselves are the main explanation of the variability that we observe. The evidence base itself, this is also important. We want to learn also about the evidence base. It's very unbalanced. First of all, we have worldwide about 70 carbon pricing schemes. We find only evidence for 21, but no evidence for about 50 carbon pricing schemes. Among the evidence that we have, more than 50% of the effect sizes are on 2 of the 21 schemes, means the Chinese pilots and the EU ETS. For 8 schemes, we find 10 effect sizes or less, and for 7 schemes, we only have 3 or fewer studies available. The quality of the primary evidence is an issue. 46% of the reviewed studies are assessed to have a medium or high risk of bias. So the internal validity of these studies is not so good, and a substantial share of the studies are underpowered, potentially reporting unreliable or inflated effects. That gives you an idea of what you can learn from studies, and also how it helps us to improve primary research. I think it's very important to call out when we have problems with study design qualities, and we need to do this in reviews. We also need to call out evidence gaps, and obviously we want to know what the evidence says overall. One last important point, obviously it's not enough to know about the EU ETS, whether or not this is effective in terms of emission reductions. We also actually want to know what it does with competitiveness. What does it do with distribution? Does it kill jobs, or does it create jobs? What about innovation effects, etc.? And we want obviously to know things about all different types of policy instruments across all sectors. So what we need to build is I think an evidence base that synthesizes the evidence from all those. And that should, in principle, be living. I think living evidence is an important concept, because policymakers often can't wait for the evidence to be delivered. And I think there is a big opportunity to now leverage the power of AI. And there are a range of larger projects ongoing that actually see to what extent we can actually rely on AI, and to what extent we actually need to be careful. So accessible, consolidated knowledge on what climate policies work would be of great benefits to all. I think it's important to work on this as a community and to catch up with the modelers in this sense. Thank you so much. If you are interested in this sort of thing, visit the What Works Climate Solutions website if you wish. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Very interesting. There is already a question. I know we're running a bit late, but maybe we can take this one. And then there will be more general question later. Juan Lopez is asking, do you have some explanation for the important medium risk of bias in the EU ETS related studies? Which criteria do you use to determine the risk of bias? Thank you.
First of all, in the EU ETS, we have low risk of bias studies. That is, first of all, very important. So these are study designs where we are very confident about, because they control well. So they have a good counterfactual where we have less where we are not so concerned that that this quasi-experimental setup leads to biased results. Just as a comparison, so finding these good comparison group is often very important, and this is in the ETS a big problem. For example, ETS and non-ETS installations are not always kind of the same. That obviously poses a problem. Interestingly, in the case of the Chinese pilots, we have much more studies that have actually a low risk of bias, because they have these different pilots, right? So you can actually design a quasi-experimental setup in a very nice way. Their problem is that you then need to work with provincial data, and that's why they have so many underpowered studies, because the sample size is always very constrained, and so it's very important to consider these things together. So in the EU ETS, we have a problem in having good comparators, or it's more challenging in a quasi-experimental setting. In the Chinese ETS, for the Chinese pilot ETS, they have this, but they have therefore more challenges in terms of the power, in terms of the way they have designed their studies.
Thank you very much, Jan. There is another question that came up, but in the interest of time, I would suggest to tackle it either in the chat or later on. Now, I would invite Kai to share his presentation and tell us more about what about ex-ante studies. What can they tell us on climate policies? We see you. We
Yes, I'm.
don't see the slides yet.
I realize that I'm confused why I cannot share my slides. So I ask your patience for a second. Here they are.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I'll cover the third aspect, the ex-ante or modeling studies. And just as a reminder, they explore basically the same questions as the ex-post analysis, namely what happens when we implement some policy. But while the ex-post is looking backward, as Maria has pointed out, and that brings some limitations, we can use modeling to analyze policies that are in the future and that are, for example, new and untested policies. I put the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism here that is about to set in. There is today no carbon border adjustment at this scale. California has done something in this area, but the CBAM at the scale of the EU, that is unprecedented, and we do not have evidence to look at. But modeling allows us to go a bit further than this. We can, for future policies, we can compare packages and designs. We can try to do welfare analysis and figure out what the optimal way or what the best, most efficient way is to implement some policy. So the CBAM is currently planned to be a border carbon adjustment, so a payment due on imports into a region with carbon pricing for everyone that does not implement carbon pricing outside this area. But economic theory tells us that these border carbon adjustments should apply to imports and exports to this region alike. And we can use modeling to explore this, just as one example. Furthermore, future is uncertain. I put CDR, carbon dioxide removal, integration into carbon pricing here as an example. We know that there's a large uncertainty about the costs, and we can then explore policies and how they would perform, what their implications would be for low and high cost scenarios, but also other variations in these scenarios. For example, different economic conditions, whether there is a boom in economic activity or a crisis. So all of these are good reasons to use modeling tools. But then if we look at a modeling study, the question is, did the authors pick the right model, or what is the right model to pick for a specific question? And one point that I want to forcefully make is there are specific models for specific questions. So there's no one right model or a perfect model that answers all the questions, but we need to pick a model that is tailored to a specific question. And one term that I want to communicate here is this margin of adjustment, the possibility of the model to react to a certain policy. For example, there are micro simulation models that basically just take how consumers spend their income. And then you can see if prices change, if a carbon tax, for example, is implemented, this is going to have implications on the burden for these consumers and maybe on their purchases. Yeah? This is a very short-term reaction. This does not include whether consumers will shift from a combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle, or retrofit their buildings to save on heating expenses. Yeah, so these kind of things are not there, but you will know in like the first year after the policy hits, this is going to be an immediate impact, and then longer term there can be adjustments, and you don't consider them at this point. You do consider them in equilibrium models, partial equilibrium models that usually cover an entire sector and model the production, the firm decisions, the technologies they choose. So this is a more medium perspective, and you might include medium-term effects of a carbon price, like fuel switching, going from coal-powered electricity to gas-powered electricity, or renewables in your mix. And then general equilibriums go a step further. They don't focus on just one sector, but try to capture the whole economy, not necessarily each and every detail, but in principle, the entire economy, and include often capital accumulation, so investments and innovation decisions. So this is a more long-term perspective where also new technologies can emerge, and capacities in these can be built up. Here's a list, non-comprehensive list of model types frequently used to assess climate policies. So the micro simulations I already talked about, and the question or the area to apply them to is often distributional implications. And then energy system models bring the added advantage of detailed technology, so they can inform questions as what is the mix of technologies, which technologies will we need in the future. Integrated assessment models take a more economy-wide look and often consider the long term, including climate damage effects in their projections, and they inform us about climate mitigation scenarios. CGE models sacrifice the intertemporal efficiency and intertemporal foresight, the perfect foresight that the integrated assessment models often have. but they allow for more sectoral detail and a more nuanced view on the impact, on the economic impacts of a policy. DSGE model kind of combine integrated assessment and CGE in the perfect foresight setting and sectoral detail. They apply to macroeconomic questions, business cycle, monetary, economic, central bank questions, inflation, and the like. And finally, agent-based models, they depart often from the rational expectations mode, the perfect foresight, to allow for more heterogeneity and behavioral aspects. And I want to close my presentation with two examples where I draw on research from this project. The first on the CBAM mechanism, second on ETS pricing. So for CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there are two dominant questions. One is, does it deliver on the promise of creating a level playing field, of restoring competitiveness for the industry that is protected there? But there's also a second aspect, which is, will it inspire other regions to implement carbon pricing? Because if other regions implement a carbon price, they will not be subject to the carbon border adjustment. And this has been explored within this project with an agent-based model, where the decision is to participate in carbon pricing. And what I want to stress here is this modeling team, they decided to consider short-term effects with limited foresight. And this is a good choice for this model, as it matches the 5 to 10 year negotiation cycles. You could also argue it matches electoral cycles, where governments decide what they anticipate for the next 5 to 10 years. What does the model do? It considers inside and outside for countries inside and outside border carbon adjustment region, how their trade is affected by these border carbon adjustments. And if they fall inside the border carbon adjustment regions, they have a carbon price, so they implement abatement and are subject to abatement costs. They later on have different revenue recycling schemes that I just wanted to mention as a feature. And this is what they report. They start with a small carbon border adjustment on just the EU, and then with more negotiation rounds, you can see that other countries join carbon pricing, and they get to full cooperation in this scenario with a carbon price of $100 and the border carbon adjustment of half this. But they do a large set of scenarios where they explore this, so they can conclude that this is a robust finding that emerges for a lot of these variations. So in conclusion, the incentive to reduce to avoid reduced competitiveness by joining carbon pricing is enough to overcome the abatement costs if you consider these short-term effects. Out of scope is retaliation, which these authors looked at in a follow-up paper, or second-order implications of terrorism and climate change. So there's a lot that you could add, but you get a first-order effect on inspiring cooperation there. The second study I'm only going to very briefly do so that we have some time for questions and discussion left. Here, the idea was, can we explain the carbon price in the EU ETS with a model by considering different properties of this model. The model is much more large scale, and partial equilibrium model of the EU, many countries, many technologies. And the model was run with different setups, and you can see the different setups produce different price paths. And you can see how the actual price matches the yellow scenario better for the first phase and the gray scenario better for follow-up phases. And this can be used to inform like how this carbon price can be explained. I can go more into detail if you're interested, then ask me. But the takeaway from the point of view of how to use models is we can run different scenarios and compare them to real-world data in order to explain the dynamics that we observe. So I want to close my presentation. My key points were the forward-looking model evaluations can fill the gap that we have by lacking evidence that other tools need, but we can also use them for policy design. And the question of which model to use, I pointed you towards consider what are the important margins of adjustment that need to be incorporated for a specific question. So with this, I'll close, and I encourage you to ask questions to my presentations, but also to the two previous ones, because Jan and Marie are still around and still there to answer your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kai. Thank you to the three of you. While we have maybe more questions, I would invite you, Kai, to maybe give a first reply on Gregor's Airbag question that was sent earlier. Is it possible to compare the ex post analysis with the ex ante analysis in the Commission impact assessment that accompanied the legislative proposal? Marie, also, it would be interesting to have your view. And after that, Jan, if you have any maybe insights or type of studies, that would be interesting. Thank you.
I would say it's certainly possible, and it should be done. The question is it being done enough? And I think we would benefit from thinking of ways to do this at an early stage. So even when the policies are informed by ex-ante modeling and implemented, to incorporate some mechanism that they need to be evaluated ex post and the comparison, and to set this up as part of the legislative process already. And that, to my knowledge, is not done at the EU level at this point.
Thank you, Kai. Marie.
Yeah, I don't know what to add, but maybe just to say, maybe not at the EU level, but at least at the researcher level, I guess what is being done is for example, taking the example of the case of the EU ETS, where maybe some ex-ante models have used certain assumptions and then shown impacts of emissions reduction or projections of emissions reductions in power sector versus industrial sectors, then they can look at the results from the expo studies and see that maybe some of their assumptions were a bit they can recalibrate their model using these exposed results to run their ex-ante models. That's how I see the link between these two.
Thank you. Jan, can research synthesis help us to do that?
Obviously, when we think about calibration, it's the same thing, right? So Marie was talking about calibration. If we have, multiple lines of evidence, we should obviously identify the best evidence. So this evidence synthesis is obviously helpful also in terms of respectively thinking about the in both ex-ante and ex-post cases to consider all the studies that are there. So in principle, yes. Are we in a position to do this at the moment? I would say no, for the reasons that I outlined.
Thank you very much to the three of you. I don't see questions yet.
Can I use this opportunity to ask myself a question then?
Yes.
I was wondering, I had a question for Jan about, it's more maybe a methodological question, but when you mentioned harmonization of the different papers, I imagine you cannot rerun the study so that all of the scope is the same. How is harmonization done? Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that?
I mean, this is obviously always a combination with inclusion in the first instance, right? So you need to include only, so we usually do that at 2 stages. At the title abstract level, we just try to make sure that we consider everything. And then we do at the full text level inclusion. And there we focus very much on questions like in the first instance, is this harmonizable evidence? So evidence that can be converted into the same effect size metric. I think that's fundamental. And so this that's why it's also important to have a protocol where we understand this from the beginning, so that we can actually do this in our process of selecting studies. But obviously there are studies that you cannot harmonize any study. Your sample is constrained, and even there are very different. This is also always a decision how far you want to go to convert a effect size into something that can be compared with something else, right? So in health, we often have just the same metric, and they only take stuff that is exactly reported in the same way. That would be difficult for us, so we need to define this a bit more widely, but it's an important question to decide how far we are willing to go, and that obviously then depends on how confident we are in terms of that variability, for example, that we observe in the end is true variability rather than, a harmonization bias, if we want to call it like this.
Okay, thank you. Marie, Kai, and Jan. I think we are more or less on time. I would suggest we now take a short break. It was foreseen to be 15 minutes. Let's say we shorten it to 10 minutes and we can reconnect back at 10:55 to dive into the topic of the acceptability of climate policies. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee. That you're ready to dive into this new module on the acceptability of climate policies. In the next 2 hours, let's say, we have 2 presentations on the acceptability of climate policy and then the testimonial from DG So to talk about the acceptability of climate policy, we'll have first Mary Sanford, a postdoc researcher at CMCC, that will tell us more about the determinant of public acceptance and what we found in the capable research. And after her intervention and Q&A, we'll follow up with Kit Smith, a senior researcher at the chair of International Political Economy and Environmental Politics at ETH Zurich. Thank you to the 2 of you for joining us. I think now I will let the floor to Mary without further ado.
Okay, thank you. Everyone see my screen, I hope. Yes, okay, great. Yes, so I'm Mary. I'm going to talk to you first about in this section that we have. So I'm going to take the part of telling you the overview of the literature on public acceptance. And then Keith's going to dig into some really interesting survey material that builds on that work. So to begin, we know that public acceptance is a necessary ingredient for the feasibility of climate policies. It touches on a bunch of different dimensions of feasibility identified by the IPCC and the special report on 1.5 from 2018. And so here we can see in this graph that there's a lot of different places where public acceptance can be an important lever. And there's been some more research that shows kind of where public acceptance feeds into this pipeline. And I like this metaphor of the Rubik's Cube, where we can think of public acceptance as, again, one important necessary lever for achieving climate policy goals. And so going back to what Jan was talking about with evidence synthesis is, the reason why we're here doing this work is to try to impact policy. But there's so much out there that takes a lot of time and diligence to aggregate. And this is the same for public acceptance of climate policy research. So when we were interested in diving into how can we improve public acceptance? How can we identify drivers and try to get closer granularity and insights onto how we can actually make this actionable? We needed to know what is the state of the field? What do we already know? How can we push that forward? So when we started this, the previous review to date had been done and published in 2015. And this review was great for identifying groups of determinants that we could then continue to build on. So the first cluster of determinants identified in this review were social psychological features at the individual level. So these are beliefs that people have about climate change, their political orientation, different worldviews, the way that they value, or the individual values that they have versus the social values that they share with others. And so mostly though at the individual level. Second cluster were how they perceive different features of policies and also different design features of the policies themselves. So in particular, perceived effectiveness. So how likely is a policy to achieve its goals? How fair it's perceived in terms of how costs or benefits are distributed across the population and across different stakeholders, the perceived costs and benefits themselves of the policy, but then also more maybe the design features of the policy in terms of, for example, if we're talking about a carbon tax, where are those revenues going to be recycled? There's a bunch of different options there. Also in terms of who's targeted, where geographically, and so on. Then the third cluster being everything that's going on in the background. So the context, so that could be the state of the economy, the occurrence of extreme weather events, media coverage of different policies, or things linked to or having some kind of impact on climate discourse. And then of course, the larger political discourse around these topics. So this review was really foundational in giving us the structure of determinants. But at the time, there were very few, there was less than 100 papers. And we know, based on, if you recall that figure from Jan's presentation, there's a huge explosion of literature in this area. And so what we wanted to do was to further map that, give that more concreteness, also provide some metadata on where this literature has been tracking over the last 10 years. So how we started this was really following that process that Jan laid out. So developing a protocol to take then to a database. We queried Web of Science and Scopus to then, with a very extensive query, to try to triangulate all of the literature that we could related to public acceptance of climate change and, I would say, mitigation policies. In this review, we didn't look at adaptation. So we first queried this database. Then we use this machine learning assisted screening process that, again, Jan previewed, to train the model to help us narrow down this initial sample to those that are actually focused on public acceptance of climate change policies in the way that our protocol defined. Then we had the authorship team annotate all of the abstracts of every article that was in this final sample of just under 400 articles to extract what countries were being, what populations were being sampled, what variables were being analyzed, with what kinds of methods, then also extracting the findings and the policy recommendations that frequently accompany these articles. We put all of that information through quantitative text analysis pipeline, so predominantly a method called topic modeling, which I'll show you the results of in a moment, and also some pretty detailed, in-depth qualitative synthesis, particularly of the findings and of those policy recommendations. So as we can see, this is the distribution over time of the frequency of articles in our sample. And so we have this dotted red line which marks where when the Drusen-Vandenberg study was published, and then everything that came after it. So we see again this explosion of articles. We cover just into the beginning of 2024, and we are covering more than 4 times what was included in that previous review, which is great. It's great to see that there's so much interest and growing interest in understanding what makes climate policies acceptable. But again, it's a challenge, mostly because when we look at the journals that this literature gets published in, we see a big mix. So a lot of these journals, so here we're just showing the top 10 outlets with the most articles in our sample, and we see that a lot of them are multi or interdisciplinary journals. Some are also very disciplinary outlets, meaning they're speaking to a specific discipline or a sub-discipline. For example, ecological economics, Journal of Environmental Psychology, or environmental politics. But even if we think about the interdisciplinary journals, there's a lot of siloing of information. There's each discipline, regardless of how interdisciplinary we all seek to be, we've all been trained in a specific way. We have different lenses, different vocabularies that we use to talk about our findings, to frame them. And so that makes this area of research very challenging, because you have psychologists talking one way, economists talking another way, political scientists, geographers, and finding the red thread through all of that motivates further the importance of projects like this, of systematic reviews. So I apologize for the blurriness of this figure, but here what we're showing is the expansion of focus over time geographically. So one key statistic that isn't truly apparent from these graphics is that in the Drusen-Vandenberg paper, there were, I think, 42 unique countries. Now, in the sample that we cover, we have more than 100. So over time, we are getting a wider focus geographically, but it's still majorly biased towards Europe and North America. And I blurred out Europe in this figure because I'm going to ask you a question about it in a moment. But then if the bottom right figure we see, or the bottom right chart, is showing, so across that topic analysis that we did, so trying to lift the topic or to extract the topic focus from each of the articles in our sample, if we look at that over countries, we do see like significant variation in where researchers, when they're studying, say, the US versus European countries versus China, there's different interests, different topics that emerge. And this gives us some insight into what researchers perceive as important, but also where there might be gaps in our understanding of say, framing and communication is very, very low in China, but very predominant in the US. And so maybe this is an area that we need to understand a bit better. So the first question, and I will stop sharing, is which European country do you think has been most studied for climate policy acceptance? Okay, Germany, France, UK. Yeah, okay, I'll go back now. I guess you guys have good intuition. Oh wait, I need to reshare. Yes, because it was indeed Germany. In general, we see a big focus on Northern and Central European countries and fewer generally on Southern and Eastern European countries. Also the UK is widely studied. I think I'm not really sure why exactly Germany is so well covered, besides being one of the largest by population in the European Union, but it's clearly a strong focus of the literature. Then across the different policy mechanisms that you might imagine being studied in this literature, which do you think is the most prevalent? And now that we can bring up. This could include very general things like net zero targets or carbon pricing or okay, great, seeing some. Yeah, you guys are pretty on it. It is indeed carbon pricing. As one can imagine, it has received a lot of not just academic attention, but also political and even kind of in the media. It's seen as one of the it is the go-to policy that people think of, and so it makes sense that that's also one of the most studied. And so we see also that has seen one of the biggest growths in terms of policy categories in the sample. And so that also, we should say that most of the policies in this literature, they are ex ante. So these studies are asking people how much they accept or support policies that don't necessarily already exist. And this is a weakness. We don't know, it's harder to do ex post policy acceptance studies. But this is one of the big gaps in the literature so far, is that we have this heavy bias towards ex ante work, and still, as mentioned before, this geographic gap with our kind of strong focus on North America and Europe. But if we look at the figure on the bottom right, we see kind of, especially if we look at the categories, the ideology, trust in government, beliefs about policy and policy design characteristics, these see a big jump if we compare it to what was present to the time of the Drews and Vandenberg study. So we can kind of see a hint that review was influential in shaping the determinants that people were interested in pursuing in the years since. So when a goal of the study was to bring more nuance to how these clusters, the three clusters that we introduced at the beginning, how they've been studied and what we know beyond just, okay, we know that these features are important, but what more in particular are we learning? And so one of the red threads that comes across the findings of this body of work is that citizen perceptions around three key issues are really, really important. The first is belief about the importance of climate change as a problem. Though I will say this is maybe foundational. I mean, you would expect, in order to support climate policy, some amount of concern for climate change as a problem would be necessary. It's not sufficient in order to get high levels of support across the board. This speaks to this gap that we see in surveys. People are highly concerned. We see high levels of concern for climate change across Europe, but not necessarily high levels of support, especially for the more stringent policies that we look at. This is something that I believe Keith will dive deeper into. The second perception is of effectiveness. So the belief about how well a policy will achieve its goal is critical, and this makes sense. This you would expect to be valid across policy domains, right? People are going to support a policy when they see it as effective, but making that effectiveness really salient specifically for climate change is even more critical. But beyond that is fairness. So people are really concerned about how fairly climate policies will affect how, in essence, the costs will be spread across the population. Because people also realize that there's a distribution of responsibility when it comes to carbon emissions. And so people see, okay, well, it's corporations, it's rich people, so on and so forth, who are more contributing to carbon emissions. Why is it that I, in my daily life, need to be sacrificing for this? And so this is also informed by the political discourse around these issues, and this consistently, the perceived fairness of climate policies is consistently predictive of how willing people are going to accept and support these policies. But also we see a clear differentiation in preferences for policies targeting individuals and companies. Again, speaking again to this fairness and effectiveness perception. People generally prefer direct regulation for companies, for those they also perceive as most responsible for generating emissions, and also who have more within their direct control to change. But they don't think that they're going to do this voluntarily. So they prefer direct regulation over companies, and they definitely do not like it for households. So for households and individuals, they prefer empowering policies that will help them make greener choices, not force them upon households and individuals. So summing up what we've learned more since this review, in regarding psychological features, we know that climate change concern is important, but it's not enough on its own to push the needle. We know that political orientation can also be a significant hurdle, though there's a lot of evidence to suggest that even amongst those on the furthest right that tend to push back the hardest on climate policies, we know that effective communication about the effectiveness of these policies can be very successful at overcoming this hurdle. We know that perceptions of effectiveness and fairness are very, very influential, but we also know that they're not always accurate. So people don't know necessarily the full picture of of what these policies set out to do, or how they're going to achieve that goal. And that kind of has to do also with the abstract nature of climate change mitigation generally. We don't see the impact of emissions reduction in our daily lives. So this is a big hurdle when it comes to aligning these perceptions. And we also know that costs will almost always deter people if, again, it's not offset by clear knowledge of benefits and effectiveness. Then another really interesting angle that the researchers across several disciplines have been pursuing are the role of how we understand social norms around climate policy acceptance. So we typically underestimate how supportive we think others are going to be of climate policy. And a lot of studies have shown so far that if we can correct that misperception, it increases the likelihood of a given individual supporting these climate policies. So increasing awareness around the high levels of support that we have, not for all policies, but more than people generally imagine, can also start to mobilize and increase more support. And again, kind of the linchpin in all of this is communication. So studies routinely emphasize, especially when we turn to the policy recommendations, the most frequent theme when it comes to what our authors say, like how can these findings that we've reached be useful for policymakers is in informing communication and strengthening communication around climate policies because of either the misperceptions or the misunderstandings or just the lack of awareness about climate policies in general and what they're actually trying to do, because there is a lot of disinformation out there, which isn't helped by a lack of trust in institutions. So they also emphasize the need to increase trust, transparency, involvement of the public in this process of policymaking in order to then also combat against polarization. So the need to depolarize the discourse, which is, again, not something that is within the direct control of policymakers trying to improve climate policy acceptance. There's a lot outside, there's a lot happening in the media discourse around climate policy, but by improving the communication and the trust around this process, this is routinely highlighted as an opportunity for depolarizing not only the discourse, but how we see over time political orientation being so pivotal in being associated with policy support. So I found this diagram from a report from the 10 Insights climate team. So it's a big consortium of climate policy experts that included in the 2024 report the importance of perceived fairness on climate policy acceptance. And so their research for arriving at this insight was just based on the research that came out on this topic in 2024, but already it's mapping very clearly onto the trends that we see more broadly in the literature about context, policy types, and design, and also, again, fairness, inclusion, well-being, and development as key kind of differentiators for resistance to climate policy or acceptance. So just to conclude, wrapping up, in this review, we're updating the evidence base that we have on determinants of public acceptance of climate change policies. In particular, we're providing more of a map of the metadata, so the countries that were looked at, the journals, the topics, going much more into detail also on that side of things than the previous review that was more focused on kind of grouping these determinants into these three categories. We're still weak on coverage of the Global South, though this is strongly beginning to change in the last few years. So what we're hoping to see in the next few years as these papers become published is that there's slowly a correction of this bias. We also see, again, as I mentioned before, a focus on ex post evaluation, we're missing ex post evaluation, and we need to go beyond carbon pricing. So the bottom line, beliefs are key. What people think is very important for shaping what they support. This is straightforward. And communication and trust can really help shape them. So just some reflections that would be, I personally would be very interested to hear your thoughts on. Do these findings align with what you expected to come out of this scientific evidence? What other kinds of evidence or information would you want to know or would you be curious about? And what are the limits of this evidence base or of these syntheses for your day-to-day work and aspirations in kind of having an impact in this space? And thanks. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mary. Yeah, that was very interesting. A lot of open questions also for the audience. But while they also reflect on this, we already have one question from Katarina. Do we know whether there is a difference on specific climate change topic, such as biodiversity, energy, and other? So would all or most of your presentation apply to all kinds of topics? Or is there, for example, a correlation with how close to home certain topics are?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So across the, sorry, Albert, should I go ahead or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so across the literature that we compiled, you see some papers approaching the topic at a very high level. So are you supportive of, say, carbon pricing or not? Or you see studies done at the very local level, so touching on some of these of this question of how do responses change when the target is more salient. In general, I think so. In overall, our review touches on anything that was related to climate, so biodiversity, energy, we would capture that in the review. But this question of global versus local, I don't know if that was, I don't think that was a criterion that we used to sort the different papers. I'm trying to think. I think that would be captured in the type of policy that we were looking at. So that's something that we can dig back into. Because
Sorry, just what I meant with close to home. Well, also, first of all, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. But what I meant with close to home is kind of like, biodiversity for some people might be a very foreign topic. Well, energy comes out directly, like they're affected by energy bills. If we switch to renewables and bills increase, then that is directly an effect, like it will directly affect your own life. Well, that is not necessarily the case if you have higher rules on biodiversity. It might trickle down at some point, but so this is what I meant with closer to home.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that's something that again, maybe Keith will get on in the next presentation about some of the work that the survey that we've done in particular in this area. Yes, I think people in general have stronger preferences one way or the other, either more negative or more positive, when things are more salient to them. And costs of energy, this is something that's always going to put people off, unless, as I said, countered by more information. And that's what a lot of the literature or a lot of the research in this area is doing information treatments or framing experiments where they say, okay, we have this really expensive policy, but one, people actually support it more than you would expect, kind of the social norm information treatment. And in the long run, it's actually going to help, say, with energy costs or improve energy security. And so when you start talking about these co-benefits, that does help increase support. I think most of the time the surveys, the experiments will also try to be, so there might be a range of policies included, so stuff that might be more abstract or more distant from people, including other things that are closer, but you're always, in general, people are trying to also customize the questions they ask to the populations. So we know of some experiments where they're conducting, okay, what do people think about the concept or the policies trying to mitigate plastic pollution in coastal regions? And that's going to be more salient to areas than to populations further inland. So we also see this kind of fine-tuning of questions to populations across the sample. I hope that answers things.
She says yes. Two other questions. One from Francesco: how to find a balance between the necessary pressure towards naming and shaming of unsustainable policies, lobbying action, unnecessarily locking in fossil fuel assets, and the importance of depolarized communication.
This is a huge puzzle because, as you say, every dimension of this problem is political, and those who want to entrench, further lock in the interests of the fossil fuel industry are very smart when it comes to trying to control the information ecosystem and the discourse around this. So I think there's, and we do see this in some experiments where afterwards people will, after all of the information treatments and all the outcome measures are asked, sometimes researchers will include a question about how biased do you think this experiment was? And you do see when you're including information treatments that are targeting, say, exposing the real culprits, people do sense a political bias. And I don't know if there's a single silver bullet solution for finding this balance. I think it's it just has to come from as many, maybe a diverse, there's also some research on the diversification of, say, of messengers in this area and how that can contribute to normalizing this information instead of it coming from just scientists or just politicians, coming from journalists or other public figures that can slowly over time start to normalize this information and remove it from like the polarization and the politicization. But yeah, that's a very, very, very big question. That definitely needs some more focus.
Thank you. And yeah, I had a similar question on communication. Of course, it comes from many studies. You need to communicate better on climate policies, but especially when you look at the EU level, the question is who should do that? Is it the Commission? Is it the member states? Is it more effective if it's, I don't know, let's say civil society in broader terms, like associations, federations that are the link, let's say, between citizens and institutions? I don't know if that's something that you looked at in the study.
You know, so one of the, so as I said, in terms, when you get to the policy recommendations section of all these papers, they talk about communication in general. They don't necessarily say who should do it. And we don't have enough follow-up studies to more accurately form advice about who should be doing this. I think there is some forthcoming work, Keith, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that was done in one of the rounds of the Capable surveys where they do look at different messenger effects. I'm not sure how generalized across what kinds of stakeholders were included in that study, but there is some, I guess, to try to answer this this kind of suggestion for future research to look at how do we communicate better. There are some emerging findings there, but I think it's still, it's going to be a dynamic problem with needing a dynamic solution. And I hope that research can be, like academic research can be part of that, but I also, you see more kind of coming from activists, journalists also looking into this, not saying in an academic sense, but trying to experiment with ways of getting across different narratives. So I think it's kind of talking back or thinking back to what Gutierrez says is we need to be everywhere all at once with this. And I think we just have to try anything and everything.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Kit, if you want to jump in, feel free to do so.
I think there's also a question from Mathieu that we can answer first.
Yes.
Okay, let's read that. First on Mathieu Niederhauser. Is this an already published study? And he wonders whether public acceptance inferred from survey may be different from when people actually have to vote on specific issues. Is there data on this?
So first, no, it's not yet published. We're hopefully going to have at least a preprint or something in the next few weeks, if months, definitely, hopefully by the end of the project. And then, yeah, this question on, yeah, people can support policies, but what do they do when they need to vote for there's going to be many times where their support doesn't necessarily align with the platforms of the parties that they are going to eventually vote for other reasons. And this is a big quandary. And I just saw that, the results from the Dutch elections this morning, the Greens losing substantial support, even though there is support in the Netherlands for climate policy. So this climate policy exists in a very complex system that is, unfortunately, as we're seeing in these years, always more complex, driven by kind of the powers at be. And that's why I think one way that research can respond to this is by including more investigation of this interaction of okay, you support these policies, but you're also maybe it's also because there's just not that much. It's kind of a problem of options, of choices not being ideal to correspond or to make this correspondence between support for these policies that in an ideal world they would like to see, but they're just not politically expedient for the political parties that they might want to support for other reasons. And so I think more work needs to be done into that. But I don't know if surveys per se are they're not going to be the only way that we can get at, or they're not going to be the best way that we can get at that kind of information. I think that needs to be complemented by the more interviews or focus groups or more qualitative work to understand more of this complexity, maybe lab work as well.
And before the study to be published, if I'm not mistaken, you are also working on a policy brief that should be available a bit earlier, right?
Yes, that should be available soon.
Thank you, Mary. Kit, if you want to react on a question about votes, politics, but also communication.
Yeah, well, first of all, good job, Mary. I think you did a nice job presenting a large amount of studies here. That wasn't particularly an easy thing to do, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask a question for you about, so do these studies, when they talk about communication as the policy recommendation, are they talking about communication of the policy impacts, or does it most refer to communication about the impacts of climate change itself? Maybe I could ask that another way, because I think there is a lot of, when we think of communication done right now to increase climate literacy, climate knowledge, climate awareness, but are the studies talking more about communication of what climate policies will do as opposed to what climate change will do, or is it a bit of both?
I think we see a bit of both. So some research, especially at the beginning end, or the beginning end, the beginning of our sample, I have the sense that they were more focused on literacy, of increasing awareness of climate change as a problem. Because also the logic would be that if people know about the problem, they're going to care about solutions. But we know that this is a bit more complicated. And so I think now there is a growing focus, though I don't know if I don't think it's substantial. I think we still need more in this area, so as to say, on what happens when we start telling people about, say, the positive impacts that could offset the negative impacts, that could also put things into comparison with other policies and other domains that are going to have even the worse impacts. You're trying to, because we often see these issues discussed in the political discourse in a vacuum, but we know that climate policy does not exist in a vacuum. We know that it can have myriad co-benefits. And so I think there is more research coming out in this area, but it could still be strengthened to, and also that kind of research is also somehow difficult because, we talk about climate policy as a need necessary at the global level, but a lot of the frictions in terms of support come out at the local level, right? And not just support, but feasibility. And so doing more research that is localized to these areas, to local areas, I think could also help gather more insights that are more generalizable, or not just generalizable, really more useful and practicable for local policymakers.
Thank you. Now, if there's any further questions, we will move on to the next lecture from Kit on social acceptability and feasibility of current policies and the results from the surveys that we launched in Capable. Thank you, Kit, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Super, thank you. Again, thank you very much for the first presentation, Mary. That I think was really helpful in giving a lot of the grounding of the background of the current state of the literature. What I'd like to do, if I can figure out how to share my slides, what I'd like to do for the next part of this discussion is to turn away from what the broader literature is talking about and focusing more specifically on one study that we've actually been doing as part of this Capable project. And so, moment. Before we get going, I'd like to turn over back to our friend, the Mentimeter, and ask everyone inductively based upon what you know, based upon, say, some of the stuff that we've been talking about so far in these training, what do you think is the biggest barrier to climate policy in Europe? So here being one keyword or a couple keywords about what do you think is the biggest problem that we have facing climate policy development in Europe? I bet, am I supposed to share something or do you do it? Ah, okay, great. Now I see the problem. I had the wrong screen pulled up. Great. So a number of different things that we have here: tax systems, information costs, political will, communication, lobbies. Lobbies keep coming up here a number of times, I can see. External events, barriers, just inequalities, costs, shifting priorities. Boy, that seems like we have a lot of issues, right? Yeah, I think this nicely well encapsulates a lot of the different problems that we've come up in the literature, and I think a lot of the different problems that we have seen in our studies as well. I really like the analogy that Mary presented in the presentation as well, that really these barriers to climate change or the barriers to the feasibility of climate change in Europe really are like a Rubik's Cube, where it is somehow mishing all of these different problems together in some ways that we as stakeholders have to figure out a way to best optimize. One of the things that we are particularly interested in this project is the barriers in terms of the barriers in terms of the citizen perspective or perceptions. Let me go back to my thing now. Can everyone see me now? Yes.
Yes.
And one of the key factors that we're focused on here is really understanding what do people in Europe want their government to do or not to do about climate change. What we have here are two kind of more recent famous pictures that we have coming out of Belgium and out of Brussels. And we really have two different perspectives on whether they want their government really to be doing something or not to be doing something. And I think a key question for policymakers or policy stakeholders is what do people want and who are the key stakeholders or say maybe key veto players involved that can make ambitious climate change and effective climate change possible. And one way that we have gone about going to try to look at this is particularly focusing on the citizen perspective side. And from this angle, what we've done is we've conducted two recent surveys. I'm going to be focusing on the first of these two, a survey that we conducted last summer, just right after the EU parliamentary elections. And this survey was a survey of 13 countries around the EU with around 20,000 respondents. And these countries more or less represent about 83% of the total European population. So we believe that we have good coverage of a lot of the perceptions around the EU in general. And a lot of the key themes of this survey that we conducted was trying to understand which kinds of policies people want, don't want, or whether people are really particularly indifferent to different kinds of policies. And particularly for the survey, we focused on Fit for 55 instruments and in a lot of cases, say EU ETS and EU ETS relevant policies. And as an overall snapshot of what we found, if we pulled all of our data together for our countries, we find that, in generally speaking, if you were to ask people, are you more or less in favor of supporting climate change policies? People are, in general, quite in favor of climate change policies across the EU. About 54% of people, on average, said that they are in favor of climate change policies, with some of the strong results coming from places like Italy, Hungary, Sweden, France, Denmark, and Spain, where some of the more resistant is coming from places in, say, Central European Europe, so like Czechia, Poland, and places like that. But of course, these kind of general overall level measures of understanding about policy support are sometimes less helpful when stakeholders are trying to figure out how we communicate policy impacts or figure out which types of policies we should advocate for that we think are maybe more or less likely to be feasible from the citizen perspective side. So what we have here are four different types of questions of things that are being kind of discussed or have been heavily debated on the European level. And so the next question I want to ask you all is, of thinking of these four different types of policies, which one do you think would draw the most public support across Europe? So a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies, so taxing profits from oil and natural gas, phasing out petrol fuel cars by 2030 with no exemptions, a new levy on beef taxes, or a new levy on airline travel. And Alberto, again, I'll turn over to you on this.
Yeah. Now you should be able to see now the poll and to take part in the questions. Few answers are coming in.
All right, so far the early responses are people think that of these four policies, people are most likely to support, say, windfall taxes on fossil fuel companies, and then maybe a little bit less extent about phase out of the sales of new petrol or diesel-based cars, or also a levy on beef. But it seems like the group thinks that windfall taxes in this case would be comparatively the most supported. So what we did in the survey is we actually ended up testing out 15 different climate change policies. We selected these policies based upon a number of different factors, namely based upon, say, their relevance to the current debate, some policies that have already been implemented or are going to be implemented. And we more or less group these across three different policy types. So ones that are EU ETS related, ones that involve some sort of direct ban on either behavior or on firm behavior, and some that have a fiscal tool, so either being, say, taxes or subsidies. And of these 15 different types of policies, now these are pooled together across all countries, the results across all countries. We found that support for, say, a EU rail fund had the strongest comparative level of support across the EU, where 70% of our sample found that they are at least somewhat in favor of an EU rail fund. This speaks to a lot of the other recent findings too, particularly with also talking about some of the other subsidy-based or some of the investment-based policies. These types of things are often well more supported than things that impose, say, direct costs or direct behavioral changes on firms or on people. And so that makes a lot of sense that people would really support, say, increasing rail around the EU. This may also be seen as just a public infrastructure investment for some. But also some things that also had larger levels of support are things like banning private planes. So banning this would really be targeting a smaller set of high emitters, and also things like having mandatory insulation policies. And particularly about this insulation policy, this also included when we talked about it, also included an element that we would provide subsidies for lower income households to also make those insulation as well. So these are some of the things that are more supported across the EU from our finding. Some of the things that are less supported are oftentimes things that are directly focusing on individual level consumption. So things like having a ban on intensive beef production practices or intensive livestock practices across the EU. So that has one where, say, 42% of people are at least somewhat opposed to it. Whereas two other elements that are, say, directly consumer facing, so taxing flights and taxing beef, two of the questions we actually asked about, are largely rejected across the EU population, where a majority of people are at least somewhat opposed to policies of this type. Notably, one thing that's interesting about our findings is that we find that overall EU ETS instruments are having moderate levels of support. So this is kind of interesting because I think maybe when we think of ETS, sometimes we think about this as being similar to a carbon tax or having some sort of tax-based element to it. But these seem to actually have less resistance than other, maybe more direct citizen-facing tax instruments or levy instruments. So, for example, we find that for our EU, our ETS, we find that people are generally more in favor than against. So something about 36% as opposed to 30% against. And these results are pretty similar about whether we ask people about whether they're in favor or against ETS instruments in general, or also specific to ETS on transport, agriculture, which would be under ETS 3, or also ones that currently exist on heating throughout the EU as well. And then lastly, as the answer to our poll, the people that responded that the windfall tax on fossil fuel companies would have been the most supportive of these are correct. That was the correct answer. So about 51% of people from our sample would have been at least somewhat in favor of having a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies. This fits with also prior literature talking about how people are more supportive of taxes as they are not, say, directly visible or directly imposed on, or see the cost directly imposed on themselves. Whereas other instruments that say maybe are proposing a tax on flights, which would increase the cost of flights for people, tax on beef consumption, which increase the cost of buying beef across Europe for people, or banning new car sales, which would reduce the potential for people to buy new different types of car. Those have far fewer support across Europe. Okay, so after looking at the more general different types of policies that people want or don't want or are happy with or not happy with across Europe, I wanted to ask a question that really builds upon a lot of what Mary was talking about is what do you think, what some of the findings say and what you kind of experienced and seen in your lives as well. What do you think are the things that really shapes whether someone accepts a climate policy or not? And here we have 4 different options, say who the person is, what their politics are, how worried they are about climate change, or what they expect to gain or lose from that climate policy itself. So we have a couple responses coming in. Some people are saying, say, the costs and benefits, what they expect coming out of the policy. Some people are saying their level of concern about climate change or worry about climate change. Some people are also mentioning the role of political dynamics or political attitudes. Less on, say, socio-demographics so far. Give another moment for people to fill this out if they want. Okay. Yeah, and I would say that in general, what you all are saying is actually really reflective of, I would say, what Mary presented from the findings of the broader literature, is that these are some of the main themes that science has investigated to try to figure out why people like climate change policies. And a lot of these really do fall into, say, the cost benefit impacts or distributional impacts perceived resulting from a policy, say things like polarization or political dynamics, as well as some sort of risk perception as well. So from our study, what we find is that by far the thing that drives people's policy preferences. So what we do here is we construct a statistical model where we put in a number of different elements that can predict people's climate policy preferences. And of that statistical model, we can disentangle how much of the policy preferences can come from different types of individual attitudes or behaviors or characteristics. And within this model, what we found is that of the say the differences that we see in people's policy preferences, about 2/3 of that is driven by what they think that policy will do. So about 64% of all the variation that we see in our climate change policy support comes from whether people think the climate change policy will have a positive impact on them, either in terms of it having a positive impact on their well-being or having a positive impact of reducing the country's greenhouse gas emissions, or whether they think that that climate policy will have a negative impact, so a negative impact on their country's economic situation or on their household finances. So really what this points to us when we looked at this finding is that what's really driving a lot of people's policy preferences are these cost benefit trade-offs that they think will result as coming from this climate change policy. So about 2/3 of what forms people's preferences really comes from these cost benefit trade-offs. About another remaining third comes from the person's individual attitudes. And by this individual attitudes, we can disaggregate that into a couple other sub-factors as well. Things like the person's level of climate change concern. So about 13% of all the policy preferences that we find, about 13% of that variance is actually can be explained by how concerned they are about climate change. trust in different political actors and also in people as well around them, so social trust and political trust. A person's environmental or, say, biospheric attitudes explain some variance. And also notably here, when we include a larger model that accounts for a number of different factors, say cost benefit impact perceptions, concern, trust, and whatnot, political attitudes actually end up explaining a smaller amount of variance. I particularly find this to be particularly interesting and maybe a particularly optimistic finding that it only doesn't come down to someone's, say, political attitudes or towards their, say, polarization, but actually maybe some of these other things that are really going on that maybe sometimes we just pick up on the larger levels when we only look at political attitudes. But notably here, very little variation overall in our model is explained by the country that that person lives in or their socio-demographic characteristics. So what this means to me is that if I want to try to figure out what shapes whether someone likes a policy, the place that I'm most first going to go to is what they think the cost and benefit impact perceptions of that policy are going to be. And then also in some ways how they trust the implementers or the people that are going to be making those policies, and as well as how concerned they are about climate change. More or less, these are going to explain by far the vast preponderance of why people do or do not support a specific climate change policy. So our last question that I want to ask you before we get into a specific study that we've been conducting on this is I wanted to know whether you agree or disagree with this statement. So the statement I want to pose to you is say, for example, most Europeans have already made up their mind about climate policies. They're either for or against them. And really further engagement with these people won't change many views. How much do you agree or disagree with this statement? So we have some responses coming in. The initial responses so far are more on the disagree with this statement, meaning, or at least the way that I would interpret that would be, is that most of you think that people in Europe haven't already completely made up their mind about climate change policies, and that engagement with them could potentially work. Some of us are, say, more skeptical of that perspective and think that actually a lot of people have already made up their minds. I'll allow for another moment or two in case anyone else wants to respond. And for this question, I don't think there's actually 100% a real empirical answer. I think some of this is kind of normative and how we actually view our other European citizens and how they see how they see climate change policies. Okay, I will change back over to my presentation really quickly. Great. So what we did is we really started from this type of question, and a lot of this came from our looking back on the past 20, 30 years of literature. And one thing that we notice about the literature on climate change policy preferences is that they oftentimes group people into either opposers or supporters of climate change policy. That we're even trying to figure out who always supports policies or who always opposes policies, who are the kind of tricky groups, and who are, say, are more green people that are always going to be in support of policies. And we were wondering, okay, well, how does this actually exist across the European population? Are most people always in support? Are they always against? Or are they somewhat in the middle? And what we found here is we dug into this, and through some different techniques, we identified that about 43% of all people in Europe are now they're always in favor of climate change policies or always in opposition to climate change policies. About 43% of those people are actually in the middle. And particularly of those 43% of people that are rather in the middle, 33% of our total sample across Europe are people whose views are conditional. That means they support some policies and they are also against some policies. So they aren't always yes, always no, but in fact, they really go back and forth. And we find that this is, and in this paper that I've linked below, we find this to be actually a very interesting constituency or faction of people across Europe. because in many ways, it's going to be hard to get the opposers to support a stringent climate change policy. And of course, you don't want to risk losing the supporters, the people that are always in favor of climate change policy. But really, if you want to get a sustainable, substantial majority, it really is about convincing a lot of these conditional people in the middle about the impacts of a climate change policy, and so that they will turn over into support. So from our finding, we find about a third of all Europeans really have views that are somewhat in the middle, and these views vary a lot depending on the type of policy. So for the next couple of slides, I really want to dive deep into this group to better understand them a little bit more, and to figure out who these people are and what makes them really, what type of policies they want and what makes them support policies or reject them. So what we find is that amongst these conditionals, this conditioned middle, their preferences towards climate change policies hinge far less on, say, their ideology or demographics, but really rather upon things that I would maybe interpret as a potentially optimistic finding, really rather upon things that we know that policymakers and stakeholders can adjust. And these are the specific policy instruments. So not just, say, a certain type of tax, but the different way that the tax is implemented, the different revenue redistribution elements that goes into a tax, who the tax is applied upon. These are things that we can actually manipulate within the policymaking process, and also the perceived cost-benefit balance of these policies. Again, that would speak to some of the findings that Mary was talking about how communication, not just about the risk posed by climate change, but about what a climate change policy will do to a person, can really shift whether they can really help shifting some of these key factors, such as someone's perceived cost benefits, to show them or to demonstrate to them that they can actually be a beneficiary of a policy. And so what we find about this is that these type of people whose views change a lot, depending on the type of policy, are really going to evaluate what they think the policy will do for them. What is this going to cost? What is it going to benefit? And that really shows, and that really is an indication to us that they are persuadable either for or against climate change policies. One thing that is also particularly notable about these conditionals is that they are a very active group of people in Europe. About 70% of them reported having voted in the most recent parliamentary elections right after this survey was taken. So these are people that aren't just sitting on the sidelines, but they do have an active voice in our electoral politics. So they are a group that matters. And notably, they are also a group that is more likely to vote for, say, a lot of the centrist parties that also oftentimes dominate our EU parliamentary constellations and ruling constellations, such as the conservative or the socialist lefts. And there is also a strong contingency amongst the conditionals that would also support, or that also voted for right-leaning nationalist parties within the most recent election as well. And if we were to look just at the conditionals about what types of things that they wanted, amongst the conditionals, the policies that they liked the most were, again, similar to the overall population, or the overall population within our EU sample. These people really preferred policies that had financial subsidies. So about 3/4 of them would support an EU rail fund. But there is also a moderate level of support for some of our banning policies, such as banning advertisements across the EU, or maybe even banning fossil fuel cards, as long as there is an exemption for certain types of cars. These are types of policies that this group may actually be more willing to support. But we find within this group that also fitting with our overall with our overall group, we do find that they are less supportive of more restrictive instruments. So I think that this is an interesting comparison that we have here, that where, say, a large number of them, almost 40% of them, would support a ban on fossil fuel based cars if it has exemptions on it. So exemptions for, say, hybrid cars or cars using using new different types of technologies. Whereas if it was more restrictive, if they were to ban all different types of cars that have a fossil fuel in them, they're much less likely to support that. So this again points to us that it's not just only talking about banning cars, but it's the specific instrument design about how cars are banned that can really shape that can really shape perspective of these conditionals. We find that to be maybe an illustrative finding there. And then if we are to look what really shapes people's perceptions, we find that their perceptions are really shaped by what they think the costs and benefits are going to be. I know I mentioned this before, but this is kind of maybe one of the key takeaways that I want to hammer home. is that very little of their overall perception is it varies by how concerned they are, their political attitudes, or the social demographics. And then lastly, if we want to look at the conditional middle, one thing we can also do is we can also look at what they would want to use different types of revenue recycling instruments for. So say if we were to ask them what they would want to use ETS-based revenues for, or say the European Social Climate Fund, what they would want to use that for. They actually prefer using these revenues for compensating vulnerable households and for adaptation. So if they would prefer to use it to compensate people who are maybe affected by climate change and investing in adaptation. They do have a slightly higher preference for mitigation, but less so investing in mitigation and more so investing in adaptation. But they are very unlikely to support policies where that would use revenue to compensate vulnerable workers, so people who work in, say, fossil fuel industries. So they're more likely to support policies that target vulnerable households, more likely to support policies that invest in adaptation, and say comparatively less likely to support policies that will compensate vulnerable workers or policies that would invest in mitigation. And if we were to look again at the overall impact of this conditional middle, is that we believe that they are a really important group that can be called upon if they have these varying policy preferences that really do matter a lot about what they think of the pros and cons of the policies directly on them, and that really can matter by the different types of instruments that go into making a policy. If these people can be motivated towards policy support, they can actually have a very large impact. So across the overall population, or across our overall sample in Europe, we found that 4 out of the 15 policies that we tested received at least 50% of support. If the people who are conditional middle that only responded neutral, so not the people in the conditional middle that were against a policy, but of those that responded that they were neutral, neither for nor against that policy, if that subsegment of the conditional middle was shifted into just favoring the policy, so just going from neutral into favor of the policy, that would shift the overall total number of climate change policies in Europe that were supported from 4 up to 10. So this shows that this group, this subgroup, even a small shift within this subgroup can have a very substantial impact on the overall level of policy support across Europe. So some of the key takeaways that we found from this study is that a large segment of Europeans have views that are not fixed. I think that that's a very important takeaway that we should view from this, is that we shouldn't give up on climate change policy, or particularly climate change policy communication, that people haven't already completely made up their minds, that there is actually a large subset, about a third of Europeans from our sample that we find, whose views are not fixed, and they go back and forth depending on what the policy is. And that the views towards these policies are largely driven by what they think the policy will do towards them. And this is good because this is something that policymakers and stakeholders can and do change. So what does that mean? What should policymakers and stakeholders do? They need to pair these visible upsides. So developing policies where people can see the benefit of the policy, even if these policies will have some cost, but showing that they do have a visible benefit directly to the person will shape and reshape this cost benefit calculation that they make in their head. So I think one thing that we sometimes unfortunately do is we make the costs visible and the benefits less visible. And I think we can do a better job flipping that around, where we also make the benefits visible as well to people. And doing so can help dilute, or can help increase, some of the electoral feasibility of policymakers without diluting the overall ambition for these. But one thing to note about this group of people is that there is the risk that they can go for policies, but there's also the risk, because their attitudes are conditional, that they can also shift against policies. So it's very important that this is a key constituency that we should be fenced into, that we should make sure that we are careful with any sort of direct or consumer-facing measure, as these are very largely rejected by this group if they see them to be overly stringent or overly punitive. So this again really speaks to how we specifically design our policies in a way that helps promote the cost and benefit calculations that come from these policies. One thing that I wanted to bring up really quickly is that if you want to know more about some of this work that we've been doing, we have created a data visualization tool. This data visualization tool actually, that you can show the link here, and I'll actually show a couple screenshots of it in the next slide. what this data visualization tool does is it shows the levels of support for all the 15 different climate change policies that we assessed across Europe. It breaks these down by social demographic, by attitudes, by the context. So many different types of ways that you can start playing with what different types of policies people want and the different reasons why. And furthermore, we also recently collected a second wave of data collection this last summer, in summer 2025, which we are also working with as well. And we will also put this data up into the data visualization tool too by the end of the project. And the focus of the second round of data collection was not just looking at who supports climate change policies, but particularly disentangling preferences for adaptation versus mitigation focused policies across Europe. So as I was saying before, here's some kind of screenshots what the data visualization tool looks like. For example, right here, we're looking at the level of support for banning fossil fuel planes across Europe, and this will be broken down by the country. We could also say, look at the attitudes towards all different types of climate change policies in Germany. Right here, this is showing for all different education levels, but if you wanted, you could also break that down by, say, people with lower levels of attained education in Germany as well. And this shows which policies that those people prefer. Or you can also create a nice little matrix like this where you can compare many things at once. So what this is displaying here is the results across all the different countries for all of our different policies. And then you can break that down by the different demographics. So whether someone has a higher level of education or also which gender they identify with as well. And so I really like this tool. I think it's a neat thing to use. I played it myself and going through and playing around with it. And if you have any questions or comments about how to use it or things that we could do to best optimize this tool so that's more useful for you, please do let us know because we'd be very happy to do that as well in the future. So that is the end of my presentation. And I think that gives us, if my timing is right, about 10 to 15 minutes for us to be able to have some questions and answers about this. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, it's great to have this presentation and also have some positive expectation and news from the survey. While you were presenting already, Katharina Hartmann had the questions on the survey itself. Have you factored in how strong these climate policies are, as in some policy might impact people's lives more and hence have more opposition?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Something that I think I would like to do, and it's I think something that hasn't been done as much in the literature, is comparing, say, not just also what people think about a policy, but what it will actually do to them. And that's a little bit more difficult because a lot of times the policy impacts are specific to each person, right? But that is something that I would like to do. We haven't done yet, where we could not just say what the impact of the policy will be on that person's cost and benefits, but also marrying that with what they think will happen. I think what is important to note here is that both of these could play a role, and that it's not necessarily explicitly what the policies will do, but necessarily what people think the policies could do that may end up driving their preferences more than another. A lot of times that we found in literature that it's actually not objective impacts, but more subjective impacts that drives people's preferences towards policies. So that may be the case here, but that's something that I would like to dig into more. But about the stringency, yes, we explicitly did try to vary a lot of the stringency on the policies and also ones that are more consumer facing versus ones that are more, say, industry facing to try to vary that out as well.
Thank you, Kit. The second question from Laura Marinelli. What about people that abstain from voting, considering that they represent a great majority of voters in some EU countries? Is there evidence on what kind of policy they would support?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we do have evidence. We could look into that. It's one that I haven't actually looked into before, but I think maybe a question for me that would also be interesting in that regard is what kind of policies would take someone who normally wouldn't vote and turn them into a voter, right? And I think that there are certain parties that are doing a good job motivating people to vote against climate change policies based upon certain types of policies. But I don't know if we're doing a good job motivating the people that normally wouldn't vote to vote based upon climate change policies. And I think that's an area that we have less information on. And I think that that's something that we could expand upon. That's a good point that we could expand upon with our findings, and that's something I think that, generally speaking, scientists could do a better job investigating as well. Because I think that's at least the way that I understand the question. I think that's a really key thing here, is to figure out what would take someone who would normally not vote and to make them vote in such a way that they would be voting for a party that would actually implement that climate policy.
Thank you.
That's a good
Mary,
question.
if at any time you want to jump in, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I would just say that so as part of all this survey, this general survey work, we also deployed experimental modules into individual countries or pairs of countries. And this question was of particular interest to an experiment we ran in France around the impact of of exposing people or telling people about carbon inequality. So if private jets polluting all of this, much more than the average French person, how does that impact their preferences for different policies? And we do also look at specifically the no vote section, because we know that it is a huge population in France. And yeah, it's interesting how they sometimes align with the right, sometimes with the left, sometimes with the center. And so, but it's super important, as you say, to track them specifically, and not just looking at where people position themselves on the left-right scale, because that obviously hides what they're actually going to do when or not do in this case. So yeah, it's a very important nuance to get at when looking at these topics and these questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Rosie is wondering, how do we encourage people to place value on common good and social well-being, as well as in their own cost and benefits? She has the impression that even if the cost to the environment, people are clearly communicated, people still don't want to change their own behavior if they see the policy as a criticism of their own action. And for example, the cost of fast fashion.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And, so for clarification, we focus on policy support, not on behavioral change, but I think that these are similar related components. And I think that if we're to talk about using the lever of governance or policies to how we can actually change behavior, say fast fashion, of course, you can come at it in a very blunt way and just ban fast fashion, right? But my guess, we don't have data on this, particularly from the study, but my guess is that that would not be widely supported across the population, because people would see this as a unilateral banning of the type of behavior type of consumerism. But one thing that we can do is try to use the levers of governance to shift what is normative and to shifting norms away from fast fashion. One way that we find that is relatively feasible from our surveys, and that some governments are also doing now, for example, is banning fossil fuel advertising. Some of this work has been done thinking also about how the norm shifts were around banning smoking advertising, say 20, 30, 40 years ago, and how banning advertising started shifting the norms of what is socially acceptable. And so we can think about these kind of starting with more softer levers that can more target social norms that can indirectly change people's behaviors, maybe a way to more better get at that, as opposed to, say, shaming people and telling you that they're wrong for buying something, because people are going to react negatively against that, and that's going to lead towards more polarization, or also towards banning something people won't particularly like as well. The difficulty about that is that's an answer that takes time, and it's not an immediate thing to do. But that is probably a way that we can get at it that's going to not risk alienating people, and also not do something that they particularly hate.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to add something about friends?
No, I was just going to say along the lines of this, of what Keith was just saying, is there are some countries, also the EU has a full sustainable textile directive that the France legislation is also leaning on. And so there it's I think it could be more effective to try to target and raise awareness about these the evils within these practices and within these supply chains, that can then raise not just awareness but mobilize more support from that kind of nudging perspective, instead of the direct control and unilateral that people might just rebel against because of the lack of control that it takes away.
And I also just posted in the chat another study that we have done as part of this Capable project where we looked at fossil fuel ad bans in the Netherlands as a potential example of some of these norm shifts. This also uses a little bit of the Capable data that I was talking about as well in this paper as well. So if you're interested, you could look at that for further reference too.
Thank you. Anya was asking a question on studies comparing different European cities' climate policies impact and their local acceptance rates.
I think that's a really good question. I think, one thing that's interesting about the Paris Agreement's framework is that we've taken what used to be an international collaboration problem and continually downshifted to the national or to the subnational level. And that puts a lot of the onus of governance on city level or regional level governance to implement a lot of these mitigation policies. I think that it would be interesting to compare some policies that are done by different types of actors and on the impact of those. So, to talk to some of our PIC colleagues and how the impact of, say, local level policies versus national level policies, what kind of impact that can have. And then also on the acceptance level as well. I think that's a very open empirical question that I think is particularly interesting. One thing that Mary mentioned is part of this study design is half of the study was we had this kind of classic cross-national comparative, which is using the results that I presented here. And the other half is where we separated into experimental designs that looked at smaller, say, country pairs, like 2 countries together. And one of the studies that we did on that was varying the implementing actor in Poland and Germany about whether it was the Polish government, the German government, or the EU implementing a policy. And so that's not on the city level, but at least that is on the supranational and national level. And we did find some interesting differences on whether people were more willing to accept it or not. And that's a paper that we also have that should be available in a preprint shortly as well, that we'd be happy to share throughout this group too, to kind of note how, so that doesn't speak to the subnational level, but that does speak to differences between the supranational and the national level.
Thanks. And to complement this answer, Anya, we're organizing, I'll say more about it at the conclusion, but we're organizing another workshop where we will share some of the studies we've done on how EU climate policies are perceived at the local level, at the regional level, and cities. We did not use quantitative methods and survey, but more, say, semi-structured interviews. And we'll present the results of this. We'll also have some testimonials from the city of Paris and the Eurocities Association on how they see also their action, how they consider acceptability, of course, in their policies. So you're welcome to join this workshop as well. Thank you. That was a great session. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Kit. We are right on time. Very smooth. So without further ado, I'm now pleased to move on to the last part of our workshop on science for EU climate policies. Actually, this morning we already talked about what are the different methods for assessment of climate policies between ex post, ex ante, and also synthesis. And we're also very curious to see and understand better how now in concrete terms this is included in policies that are developed currently. And to discuss this, I'm very pleased to welcome Vicky Pollard, the head of unit on foresight, economic analysis and modeling at the DG Climate Action of the European Commission. Thank you, Vicky, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Albert. And I'm just going to share a few slides, hopefully, if it works. I should. I just have to find the right window to share. Voila. Can you see the slides?
They're loading. Now we see a PowerPoint.
Okay.
as a screen.
Okay, so
We not in presenter mode, and we do see the blocks,
okay.
the black
Okay.
blocks of Zoom.
Ah, haha. I will try and is that better?
Yes,
Okay, I will.
very well. That works now.
Okay, so thanks for this opportunity to discuss how we use the evidence base, how we improve the evidence base for our policy making. I think in your initial invitation, there was also some discussion around better regulation frameworks. I will come back. I will start with the better regulation framework in the EU because it explains our needs and how we use information in the processes of getting to a proposal within the Commission. You probably know that we have guidelines on better regulation. We have a detailed better regulation toolbox, which was updated the last time in July 2023. We also are required to do evaluation of existing policies, as well as impact assessments. When we do these assessments, we're looking at the full social, economic, and environmental impacts, I should say. This is you can see there's a typo on my slide, I'm sorry, but so social, economic, and environmental impacts of all new proposals. And when we're doing so, and you were talking about engagement with people, we do public consultation. We issue a call for evidence. We have a structured online survey. We receive position papers in all 24 languages. We have a platform, which is the place where all European Commission surveys are placed, so that people can find them easily. And we do our surveys in a way which is aimed both at experts and at the general public. And we do get input from both, but of course, a lot of the input we get are from stakeholders who are very engaged in the EU process. We organise stakeholder events. We have to, for all major proposals and evaluations, these go via an independent regulatory scrutiny board. And that opinion from the regulatory scrutiny board needs to be attached to any major proposal that goes for decision making by the Commission. And if you want to see what the public consultation looks like, for example, for the 2040 target, which we did for the impact assessment published in 2024, we have a link in these slides and we can point you in that direction because it's interesting to see. The better regulation context is one where we're looking to deliver on the EU strategic objectives, but do so in a way which is simpler, lighter, faster in terms of the implications of EU regulation for Europe's competitiveness. That's very much the situation we're in now. And always, I think better regulation has been focused on making sure that we have legislation which is proportionate, stable, coherent, and technology neutral. The focus is on evidence-based policies and laws that are most efficient and tailor-made to meet the needs of EU citizens, business and civil society. And just to take you through quickly, these are some of the big themes. When you go to the Better Regulation website, I just want to emphasize some of them. Of course, most important, best available evidence. I mentioned also that it's an integrated approach. We're looking across society, social impacts, the economy and environment, including climate, for all policies. It's very important, of course, that this is open and transparent for citizens, for businesses and other stakeholders, that our decision-making is transparent. As I said, we do stakeholder consultations. A new feature under this commission is that we also do implementation dialogues. So every commissioner is to do 2 implementation dialogues every year to get direct feedback from stakeholders so that we have this reality check on what we do. It's also important that the EU initiatives deliver as expected and remain fit for purpose. And that's, I think, an important element in terms of the refit or the simplification exercises. This is also very much about making sure that we when we look again at our legislation, we ensure that it's doing what it's intended to do in a simple and effective way. One thing I didn't highlight here is the importance also of strategic foresight. We have a strategic foresight unit within the JLC, which does a lot of background research, a lot of horizon scanning. It's increasingly important. We have regular foresight reports from the SecGen, and those all feed into decision making. Coming more specifically to climate ambition and policy, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did on 2040 climate target as an example, but that's just one example, which I think helps illustrate how we use evidence and why it's important that we develop evidence bases and keep everything up to date. So first of all, of course, for climate policy, the IPCC synthesis report from the sixth assessment cycle was very important as a document to inform our stakeholders. And of course, that builds on all the assessment reports, the full cycle for the sixth assessment report and the work of all the working groups. This is, in terms of the big headline messages, and I won't go through these because you know these, but I think it's very important that they're broad in terms of both the temperature target, what that means in terms of mitigation, but also the feasibility of options and what's needed in terms of adaptation and broader implications. The IPCC work is important for us both in terms of our policies on global ambition, so our engagement with the UNFCCC, with our partners globally, in terms of where we think global action needs to go, but it also then informs what we do in terms of EU policy. But the IPCC work is important in many other ways. Of course, the IPCC guidelines are essential for the national greenhouse gas inventories. So it's important for our global work in terms of comparability. It's essential for the work that we do as the Commission, but also obviously for the modelling work and all the assessment that's done. What actually is happening in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. How do we monitor this in a transparent, a robust way, in a way that allows people to do comparable studies. Also very important, of course, is everything that happens on the science related to adaptation and preparedness. At the same time as the impact assessment on 2040, the Environment Agency, the European Environment Agency, came out with the first European climate risk assessment. This is feeding the work now happening on the first legislation foreseen for European Climate Adaptation Plan. This is very important in terms of preparedness going forwards, but it's also very important in terms of the general debate in terms of why we need to act on mitigation. So both on mitigation and adaptation, this is having a really important impact. When we, in terms of our climate ambition and policy, we've have a process going back. We track it back to 2008 because that's when we first started using modelling to inform climate policy in a very structured way. And you can see where the IPCC work comes in. And so the body of climate science feeding into the IPCC reports then feeds into our work through those reports. And then we're also doing our own modelling and impact assessments at each stage, again, drawing on more specific information, more up-to-date information, and information coming from all the research programs funded by the EU and others. We trawl through the literature, but we also then invite people to input evidence through the public consultation. And I think it's very important for people to note that it is very useful for our projects to provide targeted summaries for specific calls for evidence related to the specific steps in the legislative process. What I'm showing you here is the big steps in terms of ambition and policy packages, but of course behind this there's very detailed policy packages, which I think you probably looked at in some detail for some of the elements in this morning session. We're now we internally now, so we have the legal proposal now for the 2040 climate target, which is being debated again and will be in the Environment Council next week on Tuesday, with the aim of getting the EU NDC for post-2030 adopted ahead of COP30. When we have the target, of course, the focus is then on the post-2030 policy package to implement that target. And you will see the Commission Work Programme has a number of packages, both climate and energy measures in the work programme for next year for Q3 and Q4. And so, of course, the process in terms of better regulation is starting again for those proposals. And we're working quite intensively with some of the modelers, maybe here on the call today. Also to note, of course, that as we look forward, we're looking, for the AL7, IPCC AL7, and what that means for our future policy work, both international and domestic. What do we do when we're looking at ambition? Well, what we do is explore, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, pathways to climate neutrality. And we're using bottom-up models to look at terms of what's possible for different sectors in terms of pathways to climate neutrality, what that means in terms of technology needs, what that means in terms of investment, but also feeding that into the macro models and looking at in a more qualitative way at what that means right across society and in terms of broader co-benefits. So as I said, we start with the IPCC work and climate science. We use economic models to represent greenhouse gas emissions. We use a suite of models, either operated by the Commission services themselves. So for example, JLC, could be GEMI3, ECFIN, Quest, but we also increasingly using Potentia. We use the POLS model, all by external experts, primes as they present, but also other macro models, Capri, Globium, a range of different models. We ourselves, and I will come on to that, involved in co-creation for EU-funded research under Horizon Europe, and we use a lot of the outputs from Horizon projects. And we do our own contracts as well that we fund to do specific pieces of research, both for domestic and international work, and also for capacity building outside the EU, because obviously what happens internationally is also very important in terms of its impact on EU climate policy. We're increasingly using model comparisons. So for the 2040 work, we ran a number of different energy models, or we had different contractors run a number of different energy models using the same parameters so that we could compare the outcomes to basically provide a more robust picture for decision makers. And of course, when you look at our impact assessments, if, for example, you look at the 2040 impact assessment, we look at a much broader range of socio-economic impacts, so regional implications, implications for more vulnerable groups, implications for partners, trade partners, etc. So a very broad range of impacts. Just to say, this is the main dimensions when we're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions and doing the macro modeling. So we're looking at the economic. We're looking also at the energy system, both the global system, the EU energy system, and big energy sectors that rely on energy, so including the EU transport system, of course, in industry. And we're running models that look at global and EU forestry, EU agriculture, non-CO2 gases, greenhouse gases, and air pollution. And of course, these are all interacting. As I said, I wanted to look at the 2040 target communication and impact assessment just as an example of the types of information. The impact assessment was the basis for the 2040 communication. It's the basis for the NDC, and it will lead into the design of the post-2030 framework once we have the target adopted. This shows you that we looked at a number of scenarios to get us from 2030 to 2050 via 2040. For those of you who are interested, you can go and look at the details of those different scenarios, what they include, what they mean for different sectors. And our recommended target was on basically between the most ambitious and second most ambitious scenarios. We also worked with the advice from the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which was set up under the European Climate Law in 2020. Well, the 2021 European Climate Law that really became functional in 2022, started work in 2023 with its first guidance or reports being on the 2040 target. And that was also a very important input to the work we did, looking at both the scenarios, but also the greenhouse gas budget, the indicative greenhouse gas budget for the EU to inform the 2040 target. But we also do a lot more. So one of the areas, and I wanted to emphasize in particular, the need for more work on bringing together economic research and climate research. For us, it was very important to do more work for the 2040 impact assessment on the costs of inaction. We commissioned a specific piece of work using Nemesis, looking at GDP impacts of different IPCC scenarios, and ourselves did a projection of what it meant in terms of GDP right up to the end of the century, of being either implementing the current NDCs at that time, or being on track to 1.5, and what that means in terms of GDP gap or GDP loss in 2100. Saying that, I think this is obviously quite a conservative estimate, and we see a lot more studies coming out looking at both global GDP losses and more local GDP or GVA losses linked to extreme weather events, for example, which are showing, again, different figures, but bringing all of this together is very important for the decision-making process. We do a lot of work looking at benefits of climate action, obviously looking at, as I said, at the cost, but also co-benefits in terms of health impacts, morbidity, mortality, and healthcare costs. The GDP figures, for example, don't include value of life. It's important that we're presenting up-to-date figures, which are still important. And even though we have big improvements in air quality, we still have very important savings from improvements in air quality through climate action. But also, it's been very important to look at the implications for the EU's strategic autonomy, our strategic independence, for our energy security, what our exposure to fossil fuel price shocks, and what that means for our economy, but also similar impacts along those lines, but also what it means in terms of looking forward. What are the growth sectors going forwards? What's really happening in sectors which are developing very rapidly, which may not be picked up so well in our models? How do we make sure that we really provide a good picture of what's happening, what the opportunities are for decision makers? Just to say that when we do the impact assessments and the communications that go with them, we're really looking at the way beyond climate policy. We're looking at what it means for all different areas of EU policy. Of course, EU climate policy is very mainstreamed. And a lot of our work in DG Klima is actually working with other parts of the Commission who are working on state aids, who are working on transport or the energy system, on land, on regional policy, on a whole range of issues. And of course, very importantly now what happens in terms of the EU budget, but more widely in terms of investment and the Draghi reports, conclusions. All of that is work where climate policy evidence or evidence that's coming from your community is very, very important. And this is just to show some of the work we did on the investment agenda, how we summarize that for policymakers. Looking forward, as I said before, we're looking forward to the IPCC 7th assessment cycle. We follow the IPCC work as observers as the EU, but we fund a lot of the work that goes into the IPCC assessments, and we're very present in terms of making sure that the IPCC work can go ahead, particularly at the moment with the US stepping back from funding a lot of research and data sources and important information which feeds into all these processes. And we're very keen, of course, to have the working group reports ready in time for the next global stocktake, even though the synthesis report will probably be a bit too late for the next global stocktake. As I said, we are involved in co-creation on Horizon Europe programs with our colleagues in DG Research. Obviously, the Horizon Europe program, I'm sure you know, is a really important source of funding for research and innovation generally. It's the current program, 95.5 billion in budget over 7 years, of which more than 35% goes for climate action. We have the new proposal for the multi-annual financial framework from the EU, and that's proposing a budget going up to 175 billion euros for the next 7 years. And again, with important mainstreaming both for climate and environment. Our work in my unit is on the climate science destination under cluster 5. And you will see the work program for 2026-2027 was published in, the draft was published in September, so you can all access this. And for example, one of the items we've put in there, just as an example, is more work around the assessment of existing policies, evaluation, because we're very keen to have more work on evaluation to feed policy making going forwards. This is a little bit more on the climate science destination. I think you know that. And with that, I just wanted to close here because I think the time is probably ticking, and I wanted to have some time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky, for this great overview on how you take into account the research, feedback, evidence, and develop modeling for policies. So now we have, I would say, around 5 minutes for a question Q&A. While people come up with their own question, maybe I would be interested to see more link back to what we presented and discussed earlier, and understand how in the impact assessment that you're doing at the European Commission, you, in addition to the modeling, try to include evidence from ex post analysis. How do you try to include the different methods that are at their disposal? And I know you also take part into efforts like the IFCMA from the OECD and how they collect evidence on. And so I would be interested to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, so there's several ways. One is obviously that we're trawling the literature. So when we know there's an important study, we will use it either directly in the impact assessment summary, the main report. But having said that, we have 60 pages maximum limit of the main reports. And so often what we're doing, we have very detailed annexes where we do detailed literature reviews and where we're making sure we use references to make a point. So when you're, for example, pieces of work which are coming out, say from EUI or from others, I mean, I mentioned PIC, but many others who are doing important evaluation work, then we're using that to make a specific point and to push a specific case. And so we do use it directly, and usually it's in the detailed annexes. And then we have it there so that we can use it with decision makers. Often when we're writing an impact assessment, what we're trying to do is address all the potential questions that are going to come up. So we're thinking about all the issues which are going to be important. So we're trying to propose a full picture, but also predict what will come up in terms of questions from member states, questions in the parliament, what's going to be important in terms of what our stakeholders, what will trigger the interest or address the interests of our stakeholders in terms of support for policies. And so we're trying to really make it relevant to specific situations. And so updated evaluations, the sort of the techniques you're discussing where you're really trying to understand what matters to different stakeholder groups, what matters to different groups of citizens, for example, are important for us, how we structure things and what we pick up and how we emphasize them. We ourselves, for quite a few policies, not for something like a target, we can't do an evaluation of a target. But for example, for ETS or a specific policy measure, then we do evaluation reports. So we have consultants who do full evaluations of how the current policies are working. And those also then feed into the impact assessments that take place. And so, for example, there are contracts happening right now on the current policy frameworks, which will feed into the post-2030 work. And again, those consultants are picking up academic work on evaluation. As I said, we're trying to push evaluation. So for example, the European Environment Agency receives a lot of reporting from member states. Every 2 years, member states report on their NECPs. Every year, there's a collection also of projections. There's also a whole lot of energy and climate data reported. And what we want to do, in particular for the policies and measures, is make sure that the research community has access to that policies and measures database and uses it well. And so we're trying to engage with people in the community and see how to better use that information. We work with the IFCMA, which comes out of a sort of broader, more political context, with the modelers working there, for example, on how how they describe and map climate policies, and then how they use models to look at their effectiveness. But that's a huge piece of work, and so we know that there's a lot of detail needed there. And I think the biggest challenge there is just how do we make information, improve the reporting on our side so that people have the data they need to do those evaluations. And that's something which takes time because we do it through legislation, through the governance regulation. And so we have a review of that governance regulation that will be that will be coming forward next year. And as part of that, we're also looking at how we can work with member states to improve the reporting, again, whilst also trying to simplify, not impose too much burden and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of work in that area also to make sure that there's data possible for that type of assessment.
Thank you for your answer. I think slowly, unless there's any burning question in the chat, we would move on to the conclusion. People have been connected since 9, so they're all ready for the break. Thank you very much, Vicky, for your participation and for joining us today. I will briefly move on to my slides just to remind you, most of the publication and research that have been presented today comes from Capable. As for now, I would strongly invite you to go on the website of the project, where you can see different policy tools, including the literature map that you've seen, the results of the survey presented by Kit, as well as policy briefs. You can also access some podcasts around topic linked to the research we've done, and there are a series of publications, including say user manual to how to find interesting work from the different publications that we've done. There's a topic that we did not cover during the lecture, but that Vicky mentioned around how to include uncertainty and the risk linked to climate change and mitigation. That is also something that we've developed in the project and that could be relevant to some of you. Now stay tuned, of course. There is the online tool, but there are also the workshop that I mentioned earlier around local and regional action. And we organize in Florence, but also online on the 1st of December, the final conference of the project Capable, as well as another project on the assessment of the EU ETS called Life Cause. So with this, I think I thank again everyone for taking part in this workshop, the participants, of course, all the speakers. And I look forward to welcoming you to the next events that we organize and to stay tuned. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.